Chapter 1260. As mentioned before, the slope of this ski resort wasn't too high, so they didn't have to wait too long. In the time it took Murphy and the children to talk, they soon saw the appearance of the little black at the front of the ski resort. That equipment and appearance. It was Yang-yi. The result of the PK was out, but no one cared about it. What everyone admired was Yang-yi's thrilling skiing speed. He was already in a state of rapid skiing, but he could still make a sharp turn. The closer they got, the more obvious this feeling was. Maria was experienced and knowledgeable, but she couldn't help but marvel. Murphy was still a little confused, because she had never skied before, so she couldn't make a correct judgment. She could only look at Maria and couldn't help but worry. When Yang-yi reached the end of the first section of the slope at high speed, Murphy could see more clearly. She found that Yang-yi actually flew up and turned 360 degrees in the air, crossing more than half of the buffer zone. Then, Yang-yi used the inertia to slide over and continued to slide down. But at the moment when Yang-yi flew up, Murphy's heart was mixed with several emotions. On one hand, Murphy still felt that Yang-yi's performance at the moment was very cool. After all, Yang-yi was skilled and daring, and he made a very beautiful turn. In between the rise and fall, it was as if he went from moving to still, as if he was gliding on flat ground, and it didn't cause much snow to fall. On the other hand, Murphy was also worried for Yang-yi, and she blamed Yang-yi in her heart. "Why are you acting cool? What if you break your leg?" Murphy was so nervous that she ignored Shi, who was beside her, who was very excited. The little girl was fascinated by the scene, and after confirming that it was her father, she jumped on the spot happily. Now that she saw her father's great performance, the little girl felt even more proud. Shi, your father is so cool." Lu Weisha couldn't help but turn her head and say to Shi with envy. When Yang-yi reached the last section of the slope, he had already slowed down, but his figure was still very cool. He made a big arc and finally slid in front of Murphy, Maria, and the children. "Papa!" Shi couldn't hold back. She waited for her father to stop, and then she cried out happily. She quickly broke away from her mother's hand that was holding her arm, and ran happily to her father. "Come, Shi." Yang-yi smiled and raised his arm, and gestured to Shi. The little girl understood almost instantly. With a slightly hoarse laugh, she giggled and ran in front of her father. She raised her hand high, jumped lightly, and clapped with her father. "Papa, you're number one." After the little girl finished clapping with her father, she stood on her tiptoes and said to her father with a little pride, "There's no number one. Uncle David and I both have our own strengths, so this is just a small exhibition game. We'll show you how fathers ski." Yang-yi quickly corrected her. Of course, Yang-yi himself also felt that he deserved to be number one. David was only now, slowly, sliding to their side. However, it was still better to be humble when teaching children. They shouldn't compete too much. Therefore, even though David didn't mind praising Yang-yi, Yang-yi responded calmly and didn't show any arrogance at all. He had to set a good example for the children. The sun in the afternoon was very short, and it was expected that the sun would set at around 3 o'clock. Although they could still burn the midnight oil after dark, the temperature in Kiruna dropped quickly when it was night time. Yang-yi could endure it, but Murphy and the children couldn't stand such cold weather. Therefore, they planned to leave for the hotel when the sun went down. Therefore, when Yang-yi and David came back, they would take the little girls to practice skiing again. At first, Murphy was very interested in learning how to ski. However, after seeing Shi fall so many times, and how she kept falling on the same spot after putting on the skateboard, she simply couldn't show Shi's good sense of balance. After falling twice, she decided to give up and let Yang-yi continue to teach Shi. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun began to set in the west. Yang-yi temporarily entrusted Shi to David and Lu Weisha so that they could continue to teach Shi how to ski. He went down the mountain again and rented a snowmobile. He drove directly to the front of the lounge and pulled Murphy and Tong onto the snowmobile. "Mommy will sit at the back and Huawei will sit in the middle. Both of you have to hug my waist," Yang-yi arranged. Murphy had been looking forward to this moment for a long time. She pressed tightly on Yang Yi's hip and lowered her head to coax Tong Tong, who was too excited to take an afternoon nap. "We're going to ride the car." "Car? Hee hee." Tong Tong hugged his father's broad waist and smiled contentedly as he was sandwiched between his parents. However, he was more excited about the type of car than what he was going to do next. "What kind of car is this?" the little boy muttered to himself. "Motorcycle? Ambulance? Fire truck?" It was as if there was only the existence of a fire truck in his mind. Yang Yi and Murphy didn't hear the little boy's muttering clearly because the snowmobile had already started moving. The sound of the snowmobile drowned out Tong Tong's question and answer. It didn't matter. The most important thing was the experience of riding the snowmobile. Tong Tong, who was protected in the middle by his parents, didn't feel much difference. He only felt that the scenery around him seemed to be moving backwards as the snowmobile started moving. It was the same feeling as when his father drove the car. Hee hee. The little boy thought it was fun. He looked around excitedly and couldn't stop for even a moment. In comparison, Murphy was not as courageous as Tong Tong. When Yang Yi was halfway up the mountain and was about to dive down, Murphy looked at the snowy scenery below and couldn't help but grab onto Yang Yi's clothes and scream. "Slow down. Don't go too fast," Murphy shouted nervously. She was still a little embarrassed and found an excuse. Don't hit the children below." Yang Yi didn't stubbornly dive down at full speed. After all, he wanted to bring Murphy to experience riding a snowmobile. He didn't want to enjoy the thrill of speed himself. He drove down slowly and didn't continue climbing. Instead, he drove Murphy and Tong Tong around the gentle slope of the ski resort. "Yay!" Murphy was very satisfied and cheered loudly from behind. Yang Yi drove a few rounds with Murphy and Tong Tong. When the sun was about to set, Yang Yi returned the snowmobile and went to pick up Shi to check on her skiing results. Of course, Yang Yi also wanted to call Shi along. They were ready to go back. However, the scene in front of him left Yang Yi dumbfounded. Shi was already skiing side by side with Lu Weisha. Moreover, Shi's performance seemed to have improved a little, which Yang Yi didn't expect. How did she learn how to ski? Of course, Shi was still a little slow and her movements were a little nervous. However, the little girl was indeed skiing with her friends. Moreover, she didn't look like she was going to fall. "She's so good?" Yang Yi was pleasantly surprised. On one hand, he was happy for Shi. After all, learning how to ski in a day was almost impossible in the eyes of ordinary people. However, Shi still managed to learn. At least for this round, the little girl's movements seemed to be quite good. On the other hand, Yang Yi couldn't help but feel a little sour in his heart. How did his daughter learn how to ski under other people's guidance? Dad hasn't even seen her learn how to ski. Chapter 1261. It was dark, and everyone who returned to the hotel had a happy smile on their faces. Especially Shi, who had learned how to ski, beginner. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, happily holding her father's camera. She brought her little brother to look at the photos that Auntie Maria had taken. She didn't care that her little brother was right beside her. She giggled and called out to her little brother, this one is super good." Tong Tong was quite supportive. His rosy little mouth was slightly open, and his two little hands were grabbing onto his sister's arms. He tried his best to stick his head into his sister's arms to take a look. When he saw his sister's heroic posture while skiing, he happily raised his two little arms high up in the air. Hee hee. Tong Tong squinted his eyes and laughed heartily with his sister. She was finally satisfied and turned to the next photo. However, the legendary handsome didn't last for more than 3 seconds. She quickly turned to the photo of herself falling in the snow. Her little face instantly turned red. "Oh, I can't look at this." She shyly covered the camera and hid it on the left side of her body. Don't ask she why she didn't just skip the photo and move on to the next one. She didn't think that far ahead. However, the more she hid it, the more curious Tong Tong became. He had only caught a glimpse of it and didn't see anything clearly. Thus, Tong Tong couldn't take it anymore. He anxiously pulled on his sister's arm and pouted his little mouth. "Woo woo. I want to see it, I want to see it." "You can't see it." She shouted. "You can see it." Tong Tong pulled on his sister's arm and adeptly looked at his sister with his big round eyes as he muttered. She's principles weren't very strong at the moment, and she was quickly defeated by her little brother. She reluctantly took the camera back and showed it to Tong Tong while she pouted her little mouth and said, "You can look at it, but you can't laugh at me. Do you understand?" Tong Tong tugged on his sister's arm to bring the camera closer. He saw his sister's new, heroic posture. Falling down can also be very handsome, if Thomas turns around to look at her. Then, the little guy looked up and giggled at his sister. "Aya, you're really making fun of me. I'm not showing it to you." She angrily grabbed the camera and turned it to the side. However, the little girl didn't have such a bad temper. After a few seconds, she saw the photos of the fathers skiing taken by Aunt Maria. She forgot about the unhappiness just now and happily held the camera for her brother to see. "Little brother, look, Papa is really good at skiing." Tong Tong snuggled up to her sister and watched intently. She nodded her little head repeatedly and imitated her sister. "Yes, Papa is awesome." However, she and Tong Tong didn't know that at this time, their super awesome Papa was playing with water with Mom in the bathroom. It was worth mentioning that the hotel in Kiruna that they stayed in for the past 2 days was not like the ice-themed hotel that they booked tomorrow. It was completely made of ice and had a lot of personality. However, the luxurious feeling of this hotel was not bad at all. Not to mention the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the mountains in the distance, the most praiseworthy thing was that there was a big pool in the bathroom of each room. The pool was filled with hot spring water that was steaming hot. After playing for the whole day, it was really comfortable to soak in the hot spring for once. Yesterday, Yang Yi and Murphy took the children to soak in the hot spring once. Today, Shi and Tong Tong took the opportunity to look at the photos on the big bed outside. Especially Tong Tong, with his sister helping to take care of him, Yang Yi dragged the red-faced Murphy into the bathroom. A new environment, a new position, and a new angle. The process and taste were indescribable. Anyway, when they came out, Murphy's face was flushed red. Her skin seemed to have softened after soaking in the hot spring water and relaxed due to the steam. It also seemed to be covered with a layer of attractive luster. Behind her, Yang Yi looked refreshed. However, his actions were a little strange. He sneaked up to the trash can and threw a bag of things into it. Then, he laughed to cover up his laughter and pounced on the 2 children who were screaming on the bed. "Hurry up and tidy up. We still have to meet up with Lu Wei-sha and her family later for dinner." Yang Yi laughed and said as he patted the 2 children's buttocks. Although they returned to the hotel and did everything, in reality, it was only 6 o'clock in the evening. It was not even 3 o'clock yet, so Kiruna still had its own unique characteristics. Although the children were very excited during the day, in the process, they also exhausted a lot of their energy. In addition, they didn't sleep at noon. Before 8 o'clock in the evening, Shi and Tong Tong couldn't resist the sleepiness. They crawled into the warm blankets and fell asleep. Yang Yi, on the other hand, had a harder time. He let Murphy lie on the bed with her limbs spread out. Then, he climbed up and gave Murphy a massage. "You've worked hard today. You climbed up and down and fell many times. If I don't give you a massage and massage your muscles, your whole body will be sore tomorrow and you won't be able to walk." Yang Yi smiled and said gently as he massaged the muscles on Murphy's arms and stretched her tendons. Murphy had already experienced Yang Yi's massage skills countless times. Naturally, she didn't refute. She buried her head comfortably between the 2 pillows and snorted comfortably like a little pig. After an unknown amount of time, Murphy was in a daze and was about to fall asleep amidst the waves of pain and comfort. However, Yang Yi's surprised voice suddenly rang in her ears. "Honey, honey, wake up. Wake up and see the aurora." Murphy was indeed a little tired. Her original physical fitness was relatively poor, but in the past few years, following Yang Yi, She exercised every 2 to 3 days and led a regular and healthy life. That was why she was able to persist in trekking through mountains and rivers for a few days. However, even so, her physical fitness was far inferior to Yang Yi's. Now, she was in a half-awake state and in a daze. She couldn't get up. Yang Yi smiled and simply carried Murphy by her waist as if he was snatching a civilian girl. He carried her to the floor-to-ceiling window. Ah! With this jolt, Murphy finally woke up. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she patted Yang Yi's shoulder. Only then did she sit down on the sofa and look at the distant sky in surprise. The dark sky had been lit up, as if 2 long flames were dancing in the air. The silver-blue color was ever-changing. The flames extended outwards in curved folds, but the vertical angle had an illusory feeling like a curtain. It was like a 3D pattern, dazzling and fascinating. Wow! Murphy finally let go of the arms around Yang Yi's neck and cried out in surprise, "It's really the aurora. I've seen it on TV before." Yang Yi smiled and said, "Of course it's real. I'll go and wake up the children. I was thinking of going to the Ice Snow Hotel tomorrow to wait for the aurora. I didn't expect to meet it so coincidentally today." Chapter 1262. It wasn't easy to wake up a child who was sleeping soundly. Not to mention little Wan Wan. When Cece was shaken awake by her father from the bed and pulled up by her little arm to sit up, she felt inexplicably wronged in her heart. Woo 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 woo. The little girl rubbed her eyes with her 2 small hands as she sat on the bed and cried sadly. Her voice was very soft, and it felt as if she was half asleep. Yang Yi looked at the little girl who was crying so hard that her hair and cheeks were wet. He found it funny, but he also felt sorry for her. He smiled and asked, "Why are you crying? Get up and look at the aurora." Then, Yang Yi heard his daughter mumble in between sobs. "What did you say?" Yang Yi curiously moved his head closer to Shishi's mouth. "I want Papa." Cece lowered her little head, and her bangs covered her eyes and her little hands. She sniffed softly and said in a daze, "What? You want Daddy?" Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He reached out to rub the little girl's head and said, "Isn't Daddy right in front of you? Why do you want Daddy?" Yang Yi didn't coax Shishi for the time being. He turned around and woke Tong Tong up. Tong Tong was even harder to wake up. When he woke up, he cried even more sadly than his sister. He felt as if his beloved robot had been snatched away from him. Fortunately, when Tong Tong woke up and started crying, Shishi gradually woke up. She was still a little confused, so she sat on the bed and stared blankly at her little brother who was crying and rolling around, kicking his little chubby legs. Yang Yi left Tong Tong to Murphy. He went to the bathroom, wrung out a warm towel, and came over to wipe Shishi's face, who was still in a daze. After wiping away the tears on her face and the sweat stains caused by the heater, the little girl became bright and beautiful again. Especially her pair of black and bright eyes, which were still a little misty and watery, made people very happy. Shishi raised her little head and looked at her father. Then, she pointed at Tong Tong, blinked innocently, and said to her father, "Daddy, little brother is crying." Yang Yi smiled and pinched her little nose. He said with a smile, "You still have the nerve to call him little brother. Weren't you crying just now?" Shishi suddenly felt embarrassed. She cried and buried her head into her father's arms. It had to be said that even though she was a little more awake after wiping her face, she still didn't have enough sleep. Therefore, the little girl nestled in her father's arms and couldn't help but yawn lazily. Her eyelids slightly drooped. She looked like an emperor in the morning court. If the ministers didn't have anything important to report, she would definitely doze off and fall asleep again. Yang Yi called out to Murphy, then pulled Shishi up and said with a smile, "Let's go and see the aurora." The little girl's head was sleepy, and her thinking speed had decreased a lot. She took 2 steps forward and asked in a daze, "Aurora?" However, all the grievances, sleepiness, and confusion before, after seeing the colorful aurora, all of it seemed to be worth it. Wow! Shishi's head was finally awake. She nestled in her father's arms and looked at the changing sky outside the floor-to-ceiling window in surprise. Her rosy little mouth couldn't help but open as she gasped in admiration. Not only she, but Tong Tong, who had cried the hardest, also had red eyes. He sniffled and looked at the sky in a daze. Tong Tong's little brain was still very simple. He couldn't understand what kind of natural phenomenon this was. He was even in a daze and didn't know what he was doing. His big watery eyes reflected the changing lights, but there were only a few question marks left in them. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? In contrast, she was much more knowledgeable. When she was at home, she learned about the aurora from Lu Weisha. Then, Yang Yi took her to watch some science videos about the aurora. But sometimes, knowledge didn't have a chance to show up in front of the magnificent natural scenery. She looked at the changing colors in the sky, and even the aurora was mixed with some red hues. Her eyes were blurred, and she was so shocked by the beautiful scenery that she couldn't speak. It wasn't until Lu Weisha was woken up by her parents, Yang Yi had called David's family earlier, that she rushed over. With the company of her friends, she finally recovered from her daze. She excitedly huddled with her friends and chatted with them. Look, I didn't lie to you. The aurora is really beautiful. Lu Weisha said with a smile. Yes, Lu Weisha, your hometown is really amazing. The sun sets early, but there are still such beautiful auroras. She said. There are a lot of auroras, and I've seen a lot of them. Lu Weisha said. But you've only been here for a few days. I'm so afraid that you won't be able to see the aurora. That would be such a pity. But I can see it. She said happily. That's great. The two girls chatted happily, and at the same time, they enjoyed the changing aurora in the sky. Perhaps, it wasn't just good luck. It was also a very happy thing to be able to enjoy the beautiful scenery with her friends. The aurora lasted for nearly an hour. When it ended, Tong Tong had already fallen asleep in her mother's arms. She and Lu Weisha were also very sleepy. The two girls kept fighting to keep their eyelids open, but with each other's company and talking, they managed to get through it. Of course, after the aurora ended, Lu Weisha went back to her room with her parents, and she naturally went back to bed to sleep. Yang Yi covered the two children with a quilt, and then came over to the sofa. Looking at Murphy, who was lazily nestled on the sofa, he laughed. Aren't you going to sleep? Are you going to stay here and wait for the second aurora? It's rare for it to happen twice in a day. I'm not looking at the aurora. I think the sky is very beautiful right now. It's full of stars, without any light pollution, and we can see the Milky Way. Murphy said emotionally as she raised her hand, as if she was looking at the sky through the gaps between her fingers. Yang Yi looked around and gestured with his fingers. He smiled and said, "Why don't I move all the sofas over and put them together? This way, we can sleep on the sofa and look at the starry sky all night. It's quite romantic when you put it that way." Okay. Murphy happily jumped down from the sofa and rolled up the sleeves of Yang Yi's oversized shirt. She looked like she wanted to help Yang Yi move the sofa. Stop. You have thin arms and legs. Don't do this kind of heavy work. Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The sofas in the hotel were very wide, very big, very long, and very thick. If the sofas were put together, they would form a big bed. Yang Yi even took the pillows, quilts, and blankets from the other bed. Murphy happily helped to lay out the blankets. She stepped on it and pulled Yang Yi over to let him sleep first before she snuggled into the blanket. She hugged his arm and comfortably let out a long hum. Actually, this hotel isn't the best place to look at the aurora and the starry sky. I saw on the internet that in Finland, there's a hotel with a glass dome that imitates the Eskimos' igloos. The entire sky can be seen through the glass dome. Yang Yi described to Murphy and smiled. It's a pity that we're in Sweden and can't go to Finland. Otherwise, we can go and experience that hotel together. It must be very special. Murphy rubbed her head on Yang Yi's chest and chuckled. With her lazy and charming voice, she said, "I don't care about the igloos or the glass dome. As long as you're by my side, I'll be happy no matter where I go." Yang-yi couldn't help but laugh. He wanted to say a few more teasing words, but he was so touched that he couldn't say anything. He could only reach out and put his arms around Imofei's neck, lowered his head, and gave her a lingering, gentle kiss. Chapter 1263. With the company of David and his family and the tour guide, many small things were arranged properly. Yang-yi and the others were less worried. The next morning, after breakfast, Yang-yi and the others checked out of the original hotel when the sky was still dark. They sat in a small van rented by David and headed to the legendary ice hotel. After all, the city was sealed by ice and snow. The entire city was covered in thick white snow. The tires of the small van were almost stuck in the snow. As they moved forward, they made a deep roaring sound. It felt like they were going to collapse at any time. However, although the small van was driving shakily, as if it was cross-country in a rugged mountain, which made it very uncomfortable to sit in, for the children, this kind of shaky car was more interesting. Along the way, whether it was Shi, Lu Weisha, or Tong Tong, who was in her mother's arms, they were all giggling non-stop. The ice hotel was located in a small town 20 kilometers away from the city. Although it took about an hour to drive there in the snow, and the time was a little long, it passed very quickly amidst the laughter and laughter. When they came back to their senses, they had already arrived at their destination. The ice hotel's appearance was not very good. It was like a small raised snow slope, but it was really made of ice. After entering, one would find a completely different world. Like the hotel's bar, the bar counter was made of ice, and there were some patterns carved on it. However, the most beautiful thing was the translucent ice that was illuminated by the light. There were some crystal textures inside, and it was completely natural. Every piece looked different. When the light reflected, the blue light made the entire hall look cold and elegant. Staying in such a hotel was not cheap at all. However, there were still many tourists who came. They stayed in the hotel in the city and then bought a tour ticket to see the entire ice sculpture landscape of the hotel. Of course, Yang-yi and the others did not care about this little bit of money. Yang-yi was only concerned about the comfort of the two most luxurious suites that they booked. After all, they had children. If it was like the row of ice beds that they had visited at the beginning, it would be meaningless. Fortunately, after the hotel staff opened the door for them, Yang-yi saw that the interior of their suite was not bad. It was similar to what was described on the internet. The facilities were definitely not as good as the hotel they stayed in last night. There was no TV, computer, or other electrical appliances. There was only a slightly larger ice bed that could accommodate Yang-yi's family of 4. There was also an ice table and 4 ice chairs at the side. Other than that, there were also some ice sculptures on the walls. Compared to the ones outside, there were more of them and they were more exquisite. Coupled with the colorful lights, the colors of the entire room became lively. "Are there no windows here?" Murphy asked curiously. "There are no windows because it's very cold outside. An enclosed environment is more suitable for keeping the interior warm." The waiter understood English and replied in English. Murphy felt that she had asked a rather stupid question, so she shrunk her head back in embarrassment. She moved closer to Yang-yi and whispered to Yang-yi, "I didn't want to open the window, but I was wondering if the room would be too stuffy without a window." Yang-yi smiled and took her to see an external ventilation device in the room. Although there were no windows, the 2 suites they lived in had an advantage. That was, they had a separate bathroom. They could not take a bath and could only go to the toilet. But even so, compared to the simple rooms outside, it was still much better. There was no heating in the room. After all, they were living in an igloo. If the heating was turned on, the room would probably collapse. Murphy looked at the thick animal fur blanket on the bed and was a little worried that it would be too cold to sleep at night. However, they would not stay in the hotel immediately. After putting down their luggage, Yang-yi's family and David's family once again got into the minivan and staggered to Lake Rosa. However, before arriving at their destination, they first came to a small town on the outskirts of Lake Rosa. David went over to ask, and soon, they rented enough sleigh car teams. Yes, they wanted to experience dog sledding, but generally, 6 dogs pulled a sleigh that could seat 2 people. Now, in order to meet the needs of Yang Yi and his family, they changed to a larger sleigh that could seat 4 people with 12 dogs pulling it. And counting Lu Weisha's family, they needed at least 24 dogs. Including the tour guide and the others, almost all the sledding dogs in the small town had been bought. Of course, the old Swedish man who ran the dog sledding program was still very happy. He counted the money while exhaling white cold air and laughing non-stop. After knowing that they were going to take a sleigh, she asked her father curiously, "Papa, are we pulling the sleigh?" Yang Yi was stunned for a moment. He remembered the scene of going down the mountain after watching the sunrise yesterday. He smiled and patted Shishi on the shoulder and said, "No, we are going to take a sleigh pulled by a puppy, we are all." Before Yang Yi finished speaking, the noisy barking of dogs outside had reached their ears. Rushing out of the cabin, Yang Yi took the eager little guys and saw a large group of dogs outside. To be exact, it was a large group of huskies. That's right. The black and white, or a little gray hair, the black eyes and small pupils, the silly appearance, Yang Yi recognized their identity at first glance. Huskies. Why is it a husky? Murphy looked at Yang Yi in surprise and asked in a low voice. She was embarrassed to show her ignorance in front of others, so she only dared to ask Yang Yi secretly. Of course, Yang Yi knew this kind of dog very well. He smiled and said to Murphy, "They are huskies. They have another name, Siberian sled dogs. They were first used to pull sleighs because they are cold-resistant, eat little, and are very serious when pulling sleighs. In the past, hunters would pull sleighs with them to the deep forest to hunt." Murphy looked at Yang Yi in surprise, and then looked at the huskies who were staring at them before they started. She couldn't think of the so-called serious work in these legendary huskies. Are these dogs? She had already started discussing with Lu Weisha. Yes, they are very powerful. They can pull us and run, just like horses. Lu Weisha said. Lu Weisha, don't you think they are like wolves? She asked Lu Weisha, both happy and worried. It's okay, they are not wolves, they are dogs. Lu Weisha laughed. She looked at the huskies who were wagging their tails in a friendly manner and shaking their heads to rub against their companions. Her fear disappeared and was replaced by curiosity and joy. "Papa, can I touch these dogs? They are so cute." She said to her father enviously. "That's not okay." Yang Yi shook his head and patiently explained, "Because they are different from steamed bun. When steamed bun is at home, we often give him a bath, but these dogs have never been bathed, and then they have to work, so they will smell very bad." Indeed, although the cold made it difficult for the nose to breathe, Yang Yi could still vaguely smell the stench from these dogs. After all, they lived in a dog pen, not a pet dog that lived with humans. But after listening to her father's words, she felt even more sorry for these big dogs. Chapter 1264. Watching the bearded Grandpa Swede fastening the sleigh rope on the huskies, Cece couldn't help but frown her snow-stained eyebrows. "Papa, Papa." The little girl turned around and gently tugged at her father's clothes with her 2 gloved hands. She, what's wrong?" Yang Yi squatted down. The little girl's eyes were still very bright, as if there were stars twinkling in the dark night. However, her eyebrows drooped slightly and she said worriedly, "Papa, why do these dogs have to pull these sleds?" Yang Yi froze for a moment and found that this question was a bit difficult to answer. He pondered for a moment and said, "Because this is their job." But they are very pitiful. They are so small, and then they have to pull heavy things." She hugged her father's shoulder and said a little sadly, "Papa, can we not let these dogs pull us? We can take a car." Yang Yi smiled and patted the little girl's back gently. He said, "Are you worried that they will be tired?" She nodded with a serious expression. "But these dogs are different from other dogs. They like nature and the feeling of pulling sleds. When they were young, they started pulling sleds and running. They won't be tired just because they pull us," Yang Yi explained. These words were actually a bit untrue. Yang Yi also knew that the huskies didn't just want to pull sleds. He also knew that humans tamed them for their own convenience. However, Yang Yi also couldn't be sure if letting these huskies pull sleds was a kind of torture for them or just a game for them to stroll and run wildly. It was like throwing frisbees to dogs. It seemed a bit inhumane to let them run around and pick up things, but dogs liked it. They wanted humans to play with them every day. Really? She asked doubtfully. Yes, you see how happy they are now. They are jumping around and can't wait to pull us and run in the snow. Yang Yi smiled and said, and do you know? In our city, there are also some people who raise them, just like how we raise steamed buns. Ah. She was a little fascinated. But these dogs are very energetic. They need humans to take them out to play and let them run to their heart's content. If they stay at home for too long, they will feel very uncomfortable. They will bite the furniture at home and do some silly things. Yang Yi said softly, so, compared to them, these dogs who can run in the snow they are familiar with every day are still very happy. She was fooled by her father. She tilted her little head and muttered doubtfully, is that so? When they first came to the town, the sun had just risen. When they got on the sleigh, the sky was already very bright. The bearded hunter took a dog and sat in an independent sleigh in front. He shouted, and suddenly, all the dogs became restless. When it was Yang Yi's turn to ride the sleigh, the 12 huskies couldn't wait to run. Such a large group of muscular dogs ran happily. Although the sleigh of Yang Yi's family of 4 was very heavy, it was still dragged. Moreover, because the resistance in the snow was reduced, the huskies dragged the sleigh along the path that was pressed out of the snow. It was not very difficult for them to run forward. Oh! Cece was a little worried about these dogs just now, but after they started running, the little girl finally felt the enthusiasm of these dogs. She leaned back, and if it weren't for her father holding her, she would probably have fallen on all fours. Hey, Socks! Tong Tong, who had sharp eyes, suddenly shouted excitedly and struggled to stand up from her mother's arms. No. Tong Tong, you have to be obedient. Don't move. Yang Yi's left hand pressed on Shi's little shoulder, and his right hand was also about to take care of Murphy, whose head was in his arms because of the cold wind. When the sleigh sat up and sped up, the wind in the wilderness became stronger. Naturally, the body felt the temperature even lower. Fortunately, before they came out today, under the advice of the experienced David, Yang Yi asked the children and Murphy to wear more clothes and enough windproof equipment, such as face scarves. However, the children were not afraid of the cold. They did not want to wear face scarves, so they simply tied scarves around their necks and continued to shout energetically in this world of ice and snow. She forgot her previous worries and happily waved at Lu Weisha, who was on the sleigh in front of them, and whispered, "We're behind you." She knew that Lu Weisha wouldn't be able to hear her if the wind was so strong, but she still couldn't help but mutter. At this time, she felt her hand being pulled. She turned her head and saw Tong Tong, who was tightly held in her mother's arms. The little girl was a little depressed when her father interrupted her statement. She looked at her sister anxiously. "Sister, look, socks, the dogs have socks." Tong Tong said intermittently to her sister in the wind. "Socks." She looked in the direction of Tong Tong's hand and showed a surprised expression. It's true. Cece was far away and didn't pay attention earlier. She thought that these dogs' feet were black, but now it seemed that they were all wearing a pair. No, it should be said that each dog was wearing 4 custom-made black cotton socks. The white elastic band at the top was very strong. It allowed the socks to be firmly worn on their feet and protected the huskies' paws well. Also, to a certain extent, it increased the friction and made them run more cheerfully. "Wow, brother, it's true." She turned her head in surprise and said to Tong Tong, "The dogs are really wearing socks." Tong Tong felt that she had received her sister's praise. She smiled contentedly and stayed in her mother's arms. The journey was relatively monotonous. There was only one accident, which was a small section of uphill road where the snow was thick and it was difficult to walk. However, the dogs were still very smart. They stopped, turned their heads obediently, stuck out their tongues, and wagged their tails to wait for people to help them. Of course, if these huskies did not roll their eyes to look at people, they would be even cuter. When they arrived at Lake Rosa, there was a very special tourist attraction, which was to experience the icebreaker. The decommissioned icebreaker was used as a sightseeing boat, and it carried Yang Yi and the others to experience the icebreaker journey. When they arrived at an isolated lake area, facing the calm lake water that had been specially cleared of ice, there was another novel experience waiting for Yang Yi and the others. Floating on the ice lake. Chapter 1265. As they would still have to take the sleigh on the return journey, the children did not feel very sad when they said goodbye. She held her brother's hand and happily said goodbye to the dogs. Then, everyone took the icebreaker together and arrived at the floating spot on the ice lake. But there, they encountered a big problem that David had forgotten about. Only people who are 1.45 meters tall can float on the ice lake? Yang Yi looked at David, a little surprised. When he heard the captain's words, Yang Yi could not help but frown. He looked back at the children. Tong Tong, as a dwarf, he definitely could not reach 1.45 meters. And she would probably be a little bit troublesome. Yang Yi measured Shi's height every month at home. Even before they came to Sweden, he measured Shi. In other words, Shi was 1.39 meters tall a few days ago. This height was already very outstanding. She was only 7 years old. Among the children of the same age in China, there was a clear gap. This was also why every parent-teacher conference, parents would sigh and wonder why Shi was so tall when they were all Chinese and grew up eating grains. But overseas, Shi's height could only be considered above average. Lu Weisha was 1 year older than Shi. Compared to Shi was slightly taller, but not by much, just 2 or 3 fingers width. In any case, Shi was 1.39 meters tall. In just a few days, it was impossible for her to grow 6 centimeters tall. After listening to Yang Yi's question, David was stunned for a moment. He then patted his head and apologized with a face full of regret. He had not participated in this project for a long time. This history could be traced back to before he and Maria were married and had children. Naturally, he had forgotten about such a requirement. With apprehension, the children stood below the 1.45-meter height line to be measured. Sure enough, as expected, Shi did not pass. Not only Shi, but Lu Weisha also fell short. She was about 1.42 meters tall. What should I do? Shi looked at her father eagerly. Her 2 little hands were so confused that she did not know where to place them. Only Tong Tong was still foolishly happy. He did not know that he could not float in the lake. He even curiously moved his short little legs and walked around the boat, looking at so many new things. Yang Yi gritted his teeth and pulled a long face. He asked the captain if he could make an exception. Tong Tong, Shi and Lu Weisha were about the same height. Could he turn a blind eye and let them go down to play? In the past, Yang Yi did not like this practice. He felt that taking the back door was a sign of weakness. But now, for the children, Yang Yi opened his mouth. However, the strict Nordic people did not give Yang Yi a chance to make an exception. They even explained in detail why they did not allow children below 1.45 meters to go down the lake. On one hand, it was because it was not safe. They were worried that the children's body coordination was not good enough. On the other hand, it was because they had specially made rubber suits that could float people. They needed to be at least 1.45 meters tall to be able to support them. Thus, there was no other way. Yang Yi turned around regretfully. He held Shi's little hand and patiently explained, "I can't play any more." Shi looked at the group of tourists who had already gone down the lake reluctantly. Her envious eyes made one's heart ache. However, at this time, Lu Weisha ran over and comforted Shi. Shi, it's okay. I can't go down to play either. When you come to my house to play in the future, we can play this together. She quickly regained her vitality under the persuasion of her friends. She happily held Lu Weisha's hand and jumped up and down. Okay, but I want to wait until my brother is as tall as you. Then we can play together. Okay. Lu Weisha jumped up and down with Shi without hesitation and giggled. Yang Yi could not help but smile at the side. You're really an innocent child. You've never thought about how long you'll have to wait for a 2-year-old Momo to grow up to 1.45 meters tall. Although Yang Yi and the others came out to play very early, it was not long before they had to embark on their return journey. After all, the sunshine was very short. If they did not go back early, it would be dark on the way back. When they took the sleigh back to the town where they parked, the sky was obviously dark. Although there was still a bright sunset on the horizon, burning the sky like a raging fire, the sun had already set. Shi, let's go. We have to go back to the hotel, Yang Yi said. But I haven't said goodbye to the dogs yet. She reluctantly looked at the huskies who had followed the lead dog back to the doghouse after they got off the sleigh. Then Daddy will carry you. You can say goodbye to the dogs by the window. Yang Yi had no choice but to gesture to the front. He bent down and lifted Shi up high. This way, the little girl could see the dogs through the window. Oh, so smelly. Shi had just got close to the window and could not help but frown. Right? Daddy told you this morning that they look very cute, but they hardly take a bath. They just rub themselves in the snow, so they're very dirty and smelly. Yang Yi laughed. Don't touch the window. You'll get dirty if you rub your clothes against the window. But why don't the dogs take a bath? Shi asked, feeling conflicted. Because it is very cold here. After the dogs take a bath, the water in their hair does not dry easily. It is very easy for them to get sick from the cold. Also, normally, they do not need to take a bath, Yang Yi explained patiently. Although she was conflicted, Shi saw that when she got close to the window, the dogs in the doghouse all looked up at her and jumped around excitedly. This made the little girl happy again. Dogs, goodbye. Shi waved at them reluctantly and said softly. When Yang Yi carried Shi and walked in the direction of the minivan, the little girl still hugged her father's neck and said, Daddy, I think these dogs are very cute. They are like steamed bun. They are very obedient. I want to bring them home. This way, steamed bun can play with them. At this moment, in Jiangqing, steamed bun, who was obediently staying in Lan Xian's house, suddenly sneezed. He raised his head and looked around. In the end, he only saw 3 pairs of green eyes that he had woken up. Bring them home. Bring them back. Yang Yi thought about having such a large group of demon kings living in his house and felt a headache coming on. These huskies were very obedient, but when they were not at home, these guys could not resist their lively nature. They would start to bite the sofa, play with the toilet paper, and so on, and make a mess of the house. Ahem, Shi, we already have steamed bun and little Guai at home. We don't need so many more dogs, right? Besides, it's so far away. We can't bring them back. Yang Yi said with a smile. Shi was quite sensible. She sighed regretfully, nestled in her father's arms, and muttered, Yes, but I will miss them. Well, when we come to Sweden in the future, we will definitely come back to see them, okay? Yang Yi said with a smile. When the time comes, we will buy a big bag of beef and bring it to them. They will be very happy. Yes. At this time, Shi's imagination seemed to be stimulated by her father. She regained her usual liveliness and happily gestured in her father's arms. Then I will also prepare gifts for them. I want to draw pictures for them. In the world of ice and snow, the little girl's little face was red from the cold. Her innocent smile was like a snow lotus blooming softly and quietly. She was so cute. Chapter 1266. The hotel was like an ice cave. Although it sounded romantic and seemed like a fantasy, they only knew how cold it was when they lived there. At night, after a simple dinner, everyone returned to their respective suites. In Yang Yi's suite, the waiters had already considerately laid out 2 more layers of animal skins and prepared several layers of thick blankets for them. Because the light reflected from the ice was very dim in the room, Shi and Tong Tong were a little sleepy when they returned to the room, so they lazily leaned on their father. "What should we do tonight?" Murphy came back happily. Then, she looked around the room filled with ice and found that there was no place to sit down. She could only look at Yang Yi eagerly. "Let's sleep early tonight. We'll take the bus back to David's house tomorrow morning." Yang Yi smiled and brushed away the snow on Shi's shoulder. He said, "It's Lu Weisha's house in Göteborg." She was still a little reluctant to leave her father's leg. She blinked her eyes and asked, "Papa, aren't we going skiing?" The little girl was still thinking about yesterday's skiing. The little girl, who had just learned a little, wanted to continue learning. "We can't do it this time because Uncle David has to go to work and Lu Weisha has to go back to school. Next time when we come to Sweden or go to the northern city to play, Papa will take you skiing." Yang Yi explained to Shi apologetically. "Okay then." She pulled on the hem of her father's coat. Because the coat was too big, her little but could not be seen. She only slightly twisted her body and pouted her little mouth as she said sullenly, "I want to learn how to ski next time." Murphy was unwilling to be left out. Then, she returned to the topic at hand. "How are we going to sleep tonight? I just realized that there is no place to change clothes or take a bath." Yang Yi laughed and pointed to the big bed. He said, "Forget about taking a bath. Let's go back to Göteborg first. Tonight, we'll sleep in our current clothes. Don't worry about anything else. Just go to bed and sleep." "Wear my current clothes?" Murphy looked at Yang Yi in shock. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. Of course, this disbelief was directed at Yang Yi. Her eyes seemed to be saying suspiciously, "Are you sure you want to sleep without showering or changing clothes?" Would Yang Yi be able to tolerate being so sloppy? Not to mention Yang Yi, even Shi, who was listening at the side, was so anxious that she stood on tiptoe. She stretched out her right hand and let her father grab her right wrist. She asked awkwardly, "Papa, but if I don't take a bath, will I become smelly?" "It's okay, just bear with it. One night will pass. We're here to experience this ice hotel." Yang Yi comforted her gently. When Dad was in the army, he was often covered in mud and hid in the rainforest. There was no place to shower or sleep, but he still managed to survive for half a month. Although she was still worried that she would become smelly, after her father helped her take off her thick snow boots and put on new socks, the little girl seemed to have forgotten her initial sleepiness and began to jump on the bed with Tong Tong again. Stepping on several layers of furry animal skin blankets, they could not feel the hardness and coldness of the ice bed below them. The children's curiosity naturally prevailed. He. At first, Shi and her brother did not speak. They just jumped around on the bed. After all, the large bed that could fit 5 or 6 people was enough for them to freely exercise their energy. Even when she stepped on the slippery animal fur and fell down, she rolled twice on the thick blanket, lying on all fours, and laughed with a slight gasp. When Tong Tong, the little fool, saw his sister fall down, he followed suit. He slowly turned around and rolled over, lying on all fours beside his sister. Then he turned his head and looked at his sister with a grin. She turned over and crawled over like a little pig. She arched her head on Tong Tong's stomach and shook her head, making Tong Tong hold his sister's head and laugh loudly. Ha 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 ha. The little fellow's laughter was very loud, and it echoed in the large room. "You're smelly." She raised her head and said with a grunt. He. No, sister is smelly. The little fellow continued to laugh. However, because he was too fat, he could not straighten his body directly. Like a little turtle, he tried for a long time before he gave up and chose to lie down. He yelled with laughter, "You didn't take a shower." She wanted to tease him, so she deliberately turned her head and shouted, "I want to sleep with Papa tonight, not with you." Tong Tong heard this and became anxious. He turned over and tried to arch his little butt. As he climbed up, he struggled to groan, "Oh no, I want sister to sleep with me." At this time, with the help of Yang Yi, Murphy took off her thick coat and changed into a clean down jacket. Then she quickly climbed into bed and got under the blanket. However, the blanket was not warm at this time, and she was so cold that she cried out, "Don't fight, Papa is mine. Mom also wants Papa to hug me to sleep tonight." At this time, the two little fellows laughed even more wantonly. "Haha, I also want Papa to hug me." Little Tigress was still following her sister, jumping and barking. However, it was difficult to tell whether it was the sister who led the brother astray, or the brother who led the sister astray. After all, she rarely laughed so crazily. The little girl grew up and became more and more reserved. Today, she jumped on the bed and shouted as loudly as Tong Tong, which was really rare. It was as if the playful nature of children had returned. After a while, Yang Yi asked the two children, who did not feel cold, to get under the blanket. "It's time to sleep. We have to get up tomorrow morning to catch the train." She reluctantly got under the blanket. Tong Tong had not played enough, but now he was his sister's little follower, and he would do whatever his sister did. Murphy shouted, "It's so cold. Mom tried so hard to warm the blanket, but you brought in the cold air." "Ha ha, ha ha." The two little fellows laughed triumphantly as if they had done a prank. After playing to their heart's content and shouting until they were exhausted, Shi and Tong Tong fell asleep under the warm blanket. After they fell asleep, Yang Yi quietly got up and put on cotton hats that could cover their ears. After all, the temperature in the room was still a few degrees below zero. It was warmer because it was isolated from the outside, so a knitted nightcap was not enough. However, after doing all this, Yang Yi looked up and saw Murphy's sparkling eyes. "Why don't you sleep?" Yang Yi asked softly. "I'm cold." Mo Fei looked at Yang Yi pitifully. Her hands were still under the quilt. She arched a little, gestured a little, pointed at the space under the little guys, and said, "It's cold here." Yang Yi understood what she meant. He smiled gently and said, "Then come over and sleep on my right side." Murphy was immediately overjoyed. She did not dare to get out of the blanket, so she directly buried her head under the blanket. Like a groundhog, she arched a big lump and crawled over under the little fellow's feet. Fortunately, the blanket and bed were very big. After crawling over, Murphy trembled and hugged Yang Yi's arm. She buried her head under the blanket and said in a muffled voice, "It's cold here too." "It's okay. It'll be warm soon." Yang Yi pulled his right arm out of Murphy's hand, then wrapped it around her head and hugged her in his arms. He first kissed her cold face and smiled gently. Murphy was hugged by Yang Yi and finally felt relieved. She twisted her body and used the pillow to find a position where Yang Yi's arm would not be pressed down by her. Then, she could comfortably snuggle in Yang Yi's arms. She smiled at Yang Yi with satisfaction, closed her eyes, and began to sleep with a sweet smile. Yang Yi's other hand also hugged the two little fellows. His body was, at full power, like a heater, continuously providing them with heat. It was a little tiring, but just treat it as practicing martial arts. The most important thing was that his family could sleep comfortably and peacefully. Chapter 1267. With Yang Yi's protection, Murphy and the two little rascals had a good night's sleep. When they woke up the next day, Tong Tong was sleeping in his father's arms. Shi, on the other hand, was sleeping slanted over. She was practically lying in her father's arms. Her two arms were hugging her father's neck, and her head was nestled against her father's face. Even though her father's beard was a little prickly, she was still sleeping soundly. Shi's sleeping posture was very strange. Her right leg was hanging from her father's arm on the bed. Her socked foot was raised up, and it was right between her brother and her father. Tong Tong was miserably hugged by his father, and he even unknowingly buried his head in his sister's calf. His nose was very close to his sister's foot. The little rascal was sleeping very soundly. He was probably immersed in a delicious dream. After sitting on the train for a few hours, they returned to Audiobook. At Lu Weisha's house, Yang Yi, Murphy, and the children could finally enjoy the heat and hot water. First, they took a comfortable bath. Then, Maria went to the supermarket to buy ingredients. Yang Yi cooked for everyone. For Yang Yi, it was considered a simple Chinese meal. Firstly, they wanted to show off Yang Yi's cooking skills. Secondly, everyone was tired from the long journey. They wanted to take a break and eat a warm Chinese meal to comfort their tired stomachs. At night, they could go out and enjoy the night view of Göteborg. During dinner, she did not forget to pick up her camera. She wanted to take pictures of the dishes and bring them back to Lan Xian. Yang Yi did not know whether to laugh or cry. He stopped the little girl who was still in a daze. Why are you taking pictures of this? These are all things that Xian has eaten before. You have to take pictures of some special dishes, and then take pictures of some beautiful scenery. Only then can you share them with Xian. The time spent playing with friends was always short. The next day, Lu Weisha could still spend half a day in Göteborg with Shi in the morning, but in the afternoon, she had to go to school to register. Her short winter break was over and the new semester would begin. As for Shi and her family, after sending Lu Weisha to school in the afternoon, they would also take the train to Stockholm. There, after a simple day of sightseeing, they had to leave Sweden and travel across half of Europe by train. They came to the romantic capital of France for shopping. Their European trip could be said to be coming to an end. However, for Lu Weisha and Shi, this afternoon's farewell at the school gate was already the end of their reunion. They didn't know when they would meet again, so the two girls couldn't bear to part with each other. They held each other's hands tightly at the school gate and felt sad. Before she could cry, the sentimental Lu Weisha was already wiping her tears at the school gate with her backpack on her back. Lu Weisha, I also want to play with you. She looked at her friend's tears and finally couldn't help crying. Her eyes were as red as her face, which was red from the cold. She asked tearfully, Papa, can I play with Lu Weisha for a few more days? Yang Yi knew this would happen. He walked up to the two girls and gently hugged them in his arms. He comforted them softly, Shi, although we can stay for a few more days, Lu Weisha still has to go to school. She can't play with us. If we stay, we will disturb Lu Weisha's studies. Lu Weisha shook her head hard and said with a choked voice, I don't want to go to school. I want to play with Shi. Woo, Lu Weisha, you are so kind. She was stupidly moved when she heard this and cried even more. Don't cry. If you cry again, your beautiful faces will be frozen. Yang Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he coaxed them. He knew that at this time, there was no way to reason with the two girls. However, Yang Yi still didn't expect Shi to be so imaginative. She cried and pleaded, I can also go to school with Lu Weisha. I don't want to go on a trip, okay? Papa, we don't want to go shopping. I want to go to school with Lu Weisha. Yang Yi asked helplessly, that won't do. Let's not talk about whether Lu Weisha's teacher and principal will let you come to school or not. If you want to stay in Sweden to study, what will happen to your family? Xin little Yu, Shiyun, Chi, Sister Xiaowei, won't they miss you more? Shi looked at her father helplessly with misty eyes. But Lu Weisha can come to our house to play for a long time. Lu Weisha, a little girl who was older than Shi, couldn't bear it. She buried her head in Shi's shoulder and sobbed. Yang Yi paused and said softly, Actually, it doesn't matter. Although we didn't spend much time in Sweden, we still had a lot of fun. You and Lu Weisha were very happy, right? Then, when we went back, it was almost summer again. When the summer vacation comes, we can invite Lu Weisha to come to China. Think about it, our amusement park will open then. When Lu Weisha comes, we can go to the amusement park together and see if the ice palace we built is more fun than the ice hotel we stayed in. Also, let me tell you, there are many fun things in the amusement park. Yang Yi's vivid description made the two girls forget to cry for a while. They stared at him blankly and listened attentively. So, let's think about it. The next time we see Lu Weisha, we won't have much time to play together, right? Yang Yi said with a smile. Then why are we in a hurry to play these few days? It will also affect Lu Weisha's studies. Why don't you both go back to your own schools, study hard, and learn more knowledge? When the summer vacation comes, we can play together, okay? Finally, under Yang Yi's persuasion, the two girls finally said goodbye to each other reluctantly. They took a photo of a weeping beauty as a souvenir. She waved and watched Lu Weisha walk into school. She was going to embark on a new journey with her father. After returning to Stockholm, Yang Yi was surprised to find that the security of the entire city had been raised by a level. Even the familiar train station when they left the station was assigned a very strict security force. Yang Yi and his team were also under strict scrutiny. It was worth mentioning that when Murphy and Maria were shopping in Göteborg last night, they bought a pair of crystal high heels that could only be put on display and not worn. It was not because it was expensive, but because it was fragile. Don't ask why she still bought it. The power of beauty can make a woman blind. This pair of high heels was also asked by the security personnel to take out for a check. After confirming that there was no problem, they were allowed to pass. Maria, who came to be their tour guide, accompanied them and helped to explain the whole process. After that, Maria explained to Yang Yi and the rest apologetically, this is not targeted at Asians. Everyone will go through such strict scrutiny. She was apologizing to Yang Yi on behalf of her motherland. After all, such strict scrutiny and the tense faces of the policemen still scared the children. She held her father's hand nervously, not daring to leave his side. Did something serious happen? Why are there so many policemen? Murphy, who did not pay much attention to the news, asked curiously. Yes, because next week, there will be a global climate conference in Stockholm. Many countries' leaders or politicians will come here, so the level of security has been raised to the highest level, Maria said. Isn't that dangerous? Murphy asked Maria worriedly. Don't worry, Stockholm is the safest at this time. Maria laughed and said, as long as we stay away from the demonstration team, we can enjoy the protection of the president while traveling in Stockholm. Yang Yi was also very calm. He smiled and observed the surroundings. He knew that although Maria's words were a bit of a joke, what she said was not wrong. Chapter 1268. Do not underestimate the power of one country, and even more so, do not underestimate the combined power of many countries. Even the organization that Yang Yi had worked for in his previous life would not have dared to take on such a mission during a meeting where the presidents of many countries were gathered. At least, Yang Yi had not done such a thing in his previous life. In his previous life, when he was dealing with a politician from a small country in the Middle East, he had to plan carefully for a long time before taking action when the other party let down his guard. Only a fool who did not care about his own life would dare to break into someone else's impenetrable defense when the other party was heavily guarded. Even if there were such men of sacrifice, when faced with such a high level of security, the success rate of a terrorist attack would be very low. Not to mention not daring to take action, at such a time, Yang Yi had to hide as far away as possible. After all, he had a criminal record, and he could not afford to be investigated by others. After all, those scenes in the movies where people bravely charged into dangerous places were all fictional. Of course, in this world, Yang Yi's identity was just an ordinary person. He could calmly walk on the streets with his wife and children, and leisurely enjoy the scenic spots of Stockholm. Yang Yi and his family did not encounter any unnecessary obstacles in their last days in Sweden. The next afternoon, Maria sent them on a train that was unique to this world, which went directly to the European continent. The speed of the train was not fast, which was just right for them to travel all the way south and travel through half of Europe. During the one-day and one-night journey, the interesting things were not only the scenery outside the train, but also the constantly rising temperature and the two children playing in the train. When they were in Sweden, Murphy was so cold that she could not have fun. But as the train traveled south, gradually, the temperature rose, and the weather became warmer. The temperature rose from -10 degrees to above zero. Especially when they were passing through Germany, the weather there was completely comfortable. It was similar to the winter in Jeong City. Murphy could get rid of the thick cotton coat and change into her favorite pair of flannel leggings and jeans. If they encountered a bus stop that was longer and she could get off the bus for a walk, She only needed to put on a long windbreaker and didn't have to worry about the cold. Finally, Murphy, who had worn too much and looked a little bloated, returned to her fashionable and lively appearance. She was so happy that she couldn't wait to ask Yang-yi to take a few more photos of her at the small scenic spots next to the station. After all, when she was in Sweden, Murphy didn't want her bloated image to appear on camera. For Shi and Tong, who did not know the cold and warmth of the weather, they did not care whether they were wearing a lot of clothes or not. In the relatively spacious 4-bed sleeping compartment that their father had booked, the two children played non-stop except for sleeping. Although they were playing a special game, some simple actions were enough to make them laugh for a long time. For example, Shi took advantage of her long legs and climbed onto the upper bunk. Last night, when they went to bed, Yang-yi and Murphy each took one child to sleep on the lower bunk. Therefore, the upper bunk was a new experience for the children. After seeing his sister climb onto the upper bunk, Tong also grabbed the small ladder and stood on the lower bunk bed, trying to climb up. "Don't climb up, it's dangerous." Murphy pulled the ambitious little boy back. In the end, Shi stuck her head down from the upper bunk bed and made a face at Tong. This made Tong very anxious. He whined and ran around in circles, trying to find a way to get up. "Little brother." Shi giggled, stretched out her small arm, and shook it at Tong. Although they were on a European train, the height difference between the upper and lower bunk beds was not very big. Tong was standing on the lower bunk, so he could reach the upper bunk if he raised his hand. When he saw his sister reaching down, he quickly stretched out his hand as if he wanted to grab onto this life-saving straw. However, Shi reacted quickly. She immediately withdrew her hand and dodged. He. The little girl winked at her brother proudly. Tong pouted, but he was not discouraged. He still held onto the small ladder and looked up eagerly. Since he did not climb up, Murphy did not stop him. Shi and Yang-yi watched the siblings with interest. After a while, Shi stuck her head out again and tried to reach out her small hand. Sure enough, Tong acted as if he was being fished and hastily pulled her hand out. But this time, he missed again. Cece's reaction was still very fast. She immediately withdrew her hand and then laughed happily. Tong stamped his feet in dissatisfaction. An anxious expression was written all over the little guy's face. "Little brother, do it again." She saw this and stretched out her hand again. This time, Shi's reaction seemed to be slower. Tong grabbed his sister's hand. He, I got it. The little fellow finally had a little sense of accomplishment. He beamed with joy and raised his head, grinning at his sister. Yang-yi watched from the side and could not help but raise his eyebrows. Could it be? Sure enough, she was on top again. After she withdrew her hand, she stuck her head out and said, "Little brother, do it again. I won't let you catch me this time." "I'll catch you." Tong puffed out his small chest and jumped up and down confidently. However, the speed at which she attacked and retracted her hand was very fast. This time, little Xiaowei returned empty-handed. "Do you want to continue?" She stuck her head out again. Her slightly messy hair hung down, but it could not hide the little girl's happy smile. Yes. Tong was completely immersed in this game. Although he often failed to catch his sister, occasionally he could catch her, which made him so happy that he somersaulted on the bottom bunk. Ha. The little guy and his sister's presumptuous laughter echoed in the box and even attracted the attention of the train police. Later, they lowered their voices a little, but still had a good time. Why do I feel that she deliberately let Momo catch her? Murphy could not help but ask Yang-yi. Yang-yi had been holding back his laughter for a long time. He stuck his head out and whispered in Murphy's ear, "It should be. Do you still remember table tennis? She is very good at table tennis, but everyone is not willing to play with her, so I taught her to go easy on her friends. Now she is the same. She probably wants Tong to play with her, so she also goes easy on Tong. But even so, Tong was still very happy. These days, he could not stop laughing. He was more cheerful and happy than before the trip. Perhaps this was also because his sister could play with him. When they were at home, his sister always had to go to school during the day and did not have much time to play with him. It was rare that he could play with his sister in this small room. How could Tong Tong care if his sister was teasing him? He was happy enough to play with his sister. Chapter 1269. During the journey, when they passed by Leipzig in Germany, Murphy suddenly thought of something. She asked Yang Yi to let them get off the train and stop at this ancient city that carried the history of music. Yang Yi knew that the city of Leipzig, in this world, for the vast majority of musicians, actually had a sacred meaning of pilgrimage. After all, there were many classical music masters from Europe who had come out of this city. Among them, there was no lack of great musicians like Beethoven in Yang Yi's previous life, who brought countless beautiful symphonies, operas, and other works to this world. Even now, Leipzig's Conservatory of Music cultivated many outstanding professionals every year, and its ancient concert hall, countless top music masters have performed here. After being renovated in the 1980s, it was like Vienna's Golden Hall, where every orchestra and every performance master rushed like a flock of ducks. Although Murphy was in the pop music industry, she grew up listening to classical music from Leipzig. After knowing that they were going to stop at Leipzig, Murphy couldn't help but want to go on a pilgrimage. However, this idea also meant that they wouldn't be able to catch the train that was only stopping for a short time. Then what should we do? She looked at her father a little anxiously. It doesn't matter. Yang Yi smiled, waved his fist, and said to boost their morale, "It doesn't matter if we can't catch this trip, we can sit down and buy new tickets. Since we're out to play, we should have fun." "Oh yeah. Long live Papa." Murphy was overjoyed. She raised her arms and cheered. Not only that, Murphy also reached out her hand, wanting to high-five Shi and Tong Tong. Shi giggled, deliberately turned her body, and ran away. Fortunately, Murphy still had Tong Tong. Influenced by his mother's positive mood, the little boy also jumped and laughed. He tried to raise his little hand, and in the midst of his giggling, he clapped with his mother. However, the little boy's clap was not very accurate, and his little palm only brushed his mother's hand. Murphy was not satisfied. She shouted at Tong Tong, who was running happily to his sister, "Hey, you haven't clapped yet." Unfortunately, there was no orchestra performing in Leipzig's concert hall today, so Yang Yi and Murphy could only stroll around and enjoy the scenery of this music-holy land. However, in the open square outside, Yang Yi and Murphy enjoyed a unique performance. A street artist with a beard and tattered clothes carefully held his violin and played a beautiful melody. His skills were really not bad. Even though the difference between him and Yang Yi could not be seen, Murphy was still far from his level. Yang Yi even felt that the artist's skills were enough to perform in some of the country's provincial concerts. But why would an artist like this choose to wander the streets of Leipzig instead of using his skills to find a decent job to support his family? Murphy asked Yang Yi such a question. Yang Yi thought for a long time, then smiled bitterly. Who knows? Maybe he's another Entrecland. Who's Entrecland? Asked Murphy, confused. Yang Yi snapped out of his thoughts, smiled, and said, "He's a character in a story I'm going to write, but he abandoned his wife and children for the sake of art. The story is a little depressing, so let's not learn from him." When Murphy heard that, she immediately shook her head and said in surprise, "I don't like people like that, you can't learn from them." Yang Yi smiled, rubbed Murphy's head, and said, "Do you think I'm that kind of person?" The two kids did not pay attention to their parents' conversation. They were completely focused on the street artist's performance. Perhaps Shi and Tong Tong did not understand and did not know how to appreciate it, but their feelings of beauty were the same. Listening to the beautiful melody and watching the man's intoxicated performance, Shishi's expression was a little serious, as if she did not dare to disturb others. Tong Tong was also very fascinated, holding his sister's hand with one hand and his mother with the other, not moving an inch. In Leipzig, Yang Yi and Mo Fei also visited some quaint musical instrument halls. The most valuable thing to buy here was the violin. On the one hand, the workmanship was very good, and the German craftsmanship was admirable. On the other hand, it was light and easy to carry. After all, it was impossible for Yang Yi to buy a piano and carry it home when he was traveling. However, even after Yang Yi took Murphy and the children around, he still did not plan to buy one. "Why not?" asked Murphy, surprised. Yang Yi smiled and said, "The violin you gave me is enough. Why would I buy another one?" Murphy was stunned for a moment. She felt sweet inside, but she was a little stubborn, so she pretended not to care and said, "But this one is even better. Look at the materials used. It's not unreasonable that it's expensive. It's a grade higher than mine." Although she said that, Murphy still blinked nervously. She looked at Yang Yi with eyes full of worry. Yang Yi laughed and said, "Then I don't want it. I think that the violin you gave me as a birthday present can play the most beautiful music in the world." Murphy was satisfied. She shook her head proudly and snorted sweetly. "Do as you wish." They returned to the train station. Although the sunshine in Germany was much longer than in Sweden, it was already night when they returned after dinner. Yang Yi bought a train ticket to Paris. However, their train was a little late, so they had to wait at the train station for 2 hours. So late. Murphy stretched lazily in the waiting hall, then put her arms on Yang Yi's shoulders and smiled. "If I had known, we would have gone shopping at the restaurant before coming back." Although Murphy and Yang Yi were in an ordinary waiting hall, and there were people coming and going around, no one could recognize them. After all, Yang Yi and Murphy's fame had not spread to Germany yet. Moreover, in the eyes of Westerners, Asians looked similar. Even if they had heard some of Yang Yi's English songs, they would not be able to recognize them immediately. With a hurried glance, they would only think that they were ordinary Asian tourists. But this feeling was good. Mingling with ordinary people, they did not have to worry about being surrounded, and they did not have to wear big sunglasses, airtight masks, and hats. Yang Yi and Murphy liked this ordinary and free feeling very much. Shi and Tong Tong could not sit still during the 2-hour waiting time. Shi quickly jumped down from the bench with her brother and ran around the bench that they were sitting on happily. "Brother, come and chase me. Hee, you can't catch me." She ran in front, and her bell-like laughter echoed in the train station. Little Swan Ni was also giggling, but he was busy chasing after his sister, so his laughter was not obvious. He only shook his little butt and ran behind his sister. Even if he could not catch up, he was still very happy. But soon, the two little guys were stopped by their father. Yang Yi still paid attention to the quality of children's education. He was worried that the two little guys would disturb the quiet and orderly atmosphere of the train station, so he quickly waved his hand and said, Shi, mommy, come here." They could not play, and they had to listen to their father's reasoning. Shi and mommy were sandwiched in their father's arms and could not move. But at this time, the clear sound of a piano came from not far away, which attracted the attention of the two little guys who were a little impatient. Chapter 1270. Someone's Playing the Piano. She had been learning piano from her parents for a semester. Although she wasn't very good at it and was only at the beginner level in Yang Yi's eyes, she was very sensitive to the sound of the piano. She immediately poked her head out of her father's arms and looked around with her big bright eyes. She quickly locked onto the direction. Piano. Tong Tong hadn't reacted yet. He was attracted by his sister's reaction and looked forward in confusion. Seeing that the two little guys were so interested and that it was indeed boring to just sit there, Yang Yi let go of his arms and patted their little butts. He smiled and said, "Let's go and take a look." When Yang Yi bought the tickets, he had asked the railway staff to arrange for the large pieces of luggage to be loaded onto the luggage car. Therefore, Yang Yi and Murphy only had to carry a carry-on luggage bag and bring the children to the sound of the piano. It turned out that there was also a piano in the corner of the waiting hall of the train station in Leipzig. Why was it also? Because when he saw this piano, Yang Yi suddenly recalled that when his family was in America, there was also such a piano in Fort Worth St. Lucas Square. However, that was a vertical piano, while the one in front of him was a grand piano. It was indeed a city of music. The city government wasn't stingy with their investment in music. Young E and Murphy brought Shi and Tong Tong to a nearby chair and sat down. Shi might have felt that the angle of the piano was too small, so she simply stood up and pinched the hem of her shirt while focusing on the person playing the piano. The person playing the piano was a tall Caucasian youth. He was probably also a tourist in Leipzig because he was carrying a small backpack. Although he was only playing at an amateur level, to Yang Yi's picky ears, there were many mistakes in the sound and rhythm. However, he was playing very seriously. His expression was focused, and he was not disturbed by the surrounding passengers. Even his eyes were focused, giving people the feeling that he was not at the train station, but at the Leipzig concert hall. This kind of dedication really made people feel his love for music. Naturally, although he didn't play perfectly, there were still many tourists with kind smiles on their faces. They raised their phones or cameras to take pictures or videos of him. After the young man finished his performance, he thanked the audience amidst a round of applause and left quietly. The waiting hall of the train station returned to silence and order. However, Shi was still by her father's side, looking in the direction of the piano from time to time. The little girl's expression was a little hesitant. On the other hand, Tong Tong was a little impatient. He struggled out of his father's arms and looked left and right. He was afraid that his father would scold him, so he deliberately walked to the other side. Then, he turned around and walked back to his sister. He. Tong Tong had just lifted his evil little paws when he realized that his sister had suddenly turned her head. He was instantly embarrassed and could only smile awkwardly at his sister. Sister, I caught you. Wow, this little guy wanted to play with his sister, but he didn't say so directly. He secretly wanted to play a prank on his sister so that she would catch him. However, she was a little absent-minded. She reached out her hand and shushed Tong Tong. She whispered, "Don't make noise. Be quiet." Tong Tong shrunk his head and followed his sister's example. He beamed with joy and shushed his sister. Yang Yi could tell that something was wrong. He stood up and gently placed his hand on the little girl's shoulder. He smiled and said, Shi, let's go and see what the piano looks like, okay? He did not say it directly because he knew that she would be a little shy. This suggestion was exactly what she wanted. She happily lifted her little head and looked at her father. She did not say anything and just happily stuffed her little hand into her father's hand. Yang Yi pulled Shi and brought her to the piano. The little girl curiously poked her little head out to look at this piano that belonged to someone else. The little girl, who had a good upbringing, was very sensible. She only dared to look but did not dare to touch it. She did not even dare to touch the piano stool. "Do you want to try it?" Yang Yi asked Shi with a smile. "Can I play it?" The little girl looked at her father with some surprise and asked. "Yes, it's placed here for tourists to play when they are waiting for the bus. We are tourists, so of course we can play it." Yang Yi smiled and pointed at the piano stool. He said, "Come on, sit on it and try it." However, Shi was still a little embarrassed. She giggled, hugged her father's hand, and hid behind him. She shyly said, "I don't want to." "What are you afraid of? You have been learning the piano for half a year. You can play a few songs. Play your favorite song and let everyone hear it." Yang Yi said encouragingly, "Learning music, you have to be bold to show it. Only then will there be more progress in the future." Yang Yi also wanted to cultivate his daughter's courage. Although the little girl has participated in many stage performances, but this kind of impromptu performance in front of a group of strange tourists requires a lot of courage. Perhaps she wanted to give it a try. Shi's expression was now a little moved by her father's words. She shyly grabbed her father's finger with one hand and secretly touched the piano keys with the other. She hesitantly looked at her father and said, But I still don't play very well." "It doesn't matter. No one will laugh at you." Yang Yi smiled and said, "Moreover, look at that big brother just now. He didn't play very well. Didn't everyone like his performance? Didn't they all applaud him?" "I applauded too." Shi's eyes wandered as she whispered, Well, come on, give it a try. Play your favorite and most familiar song. Even the birthday song is fine." Under her father's encouragement, Shishi finally sat on the piano stool. However, she was still a little embarrassed. She placed her 2 small hands on the black and white piano keys and looked at her father for help. At this time, there were already many tourists nearby who noticed this scene. Everyone saw an Asian little girl sitting on the piano stool. Moreover, her nervous appearance was a little pitiful. They spontaneously applauded for Shishi. Shishi looked to the side in surprise. Those kind smiles made the little girl nervous for a while, and then relaxed a little. "Look, everyone is looking forward to your performance," Yang Yi said with a smile. "Come on, Shishi. Dad believes in you." Yang Yi let go of Shishi's hand and gave her a last encouraging look. Then, he took a little step back to give Shishi an independent performance space. Then, he picked up the camera hanging around his neck and took 2 photos first. Then, he prepared to record Shishi. Chapter 1271. After the encouraging applause, the train station returned to its original silence. It was as if everyone was listening to a concert, except for some announcements on the platform. They were all smiling and looking expectantly at the Asian girl sitting in front of the piano. Shishi's outfit today was very fresh and cute. Because of the warm weather in Germany, the girl didn't need to wear thick clothes. She wore a pink sports jacket and a pair of black slim pants. She didn't even need to wear a hat. The pink headband that matched the jacket combed her long hair. From the back, she looked elegant and natural. Moreover, the girl was born beautiful. With a serious expression on her delicate little face, it was enough to make people want to cherish her. Without further ado, Shishi sat in front of the piano attentively. Although she was still a little nervous, she had already mustered up her courage and began to gently press on the piano strings. "Hey, it's To Alice." Yang Yi raised his eyebrows in surprise when he heard the first few notes. He played this song for Shishi before he played the song Snail for Shishi. It wasn't difficult, but it wasn't particularly easy either. After all, the original version of To Alice had very high requirements, but the later version was much simpler. Yang Yi also gave Richard's version of To Alice to Shishi to practice. The girl liked this song very much. In the beginning, she played it messily, but after practicing for half a year, she could occasionally play it coherently. However, Yang Yi didn't expect Shishi to play such a song. This was the girl's first time playing the piano outside. Yang Yi was worried that she didn't have the confidence, so he only asked her to play a super simple song like the birthday song. In any case, Shishi's performance began. Her right foot gently stepped on the pedal, and the slender fingers of her 2 small hands danced on the piano keys like a butterfly. It looked very beautiful. If there weren't a few wrong notes, it would be even more beautiful. She was still a little nervous. Not only did she play a few wrong notes, but she also played a little hurriedly. The melody was obviously a little fast. However, Yang Yi did not intend to guide her for the time being. He looked at the little girl expectantly, hoping that she would be able to adjust herself. "You can do it, Shishi. You are Daddy's pride," Yang Yi thought to himself. However, at this moment, there was a bit of commotion in the spectator stands. It wasn't that she played too badly. Although the little girl played the wrong notes and played a little too fast, no one would be so picky about a 7-year-old girl. The moving melody of To Alice was still very beautiful, and many knowledgeable tourists suddenly felt its extraordinariness. "What song is this?" People curiously asked their companions, thinking that they were just ignorant. However, the commotion did not stop because everyone realized that no one knew what song it was. It was Yang Yi's fault for being lazy and not releasing the good stuff. However, everyone's whispers were still politely maintained at a very low decibel level. It did not affect Shishi, who was focused on playing the piano. Shishi's playing condition was getting better and better. In the beginning, the little girl was indeed very nervous. Her fingers did not dare to press down hard, and she even played the wrong notes while trembling. If it was someone else, they might be even more nervous and even more afraid to play. However, she felt her father's support behind her, so she persevered. The little girl's memory was very good. She did not need to look at the score at all. In addition, she had practiced this song for half a year. She played it very skillfully. After playing for the first time, she became calmer and calmer. However, the serious expression on her face eased slightly, and the rhythm of the music also returned to a normal level. All of a sudden, the gentle charm of "To Alice" was reflected. The people in the discussion quieted down and listened with fascination. There were even some people who just wanted to watch the fun who could not help but take out their phones to record. Yang Yi, who was standing behind Shi, also revealed a gratified smile. She was indeed Yang Yi's daughter. Her character was tough enough. A competition-type player. Yang Yi thought of the evaluation of Shi by teacher Xia Suqing, who taught Shi's dance class in Huijia Primary School. His heart was brimming with pride for Shi. Of course, it did not mean that Shi played very well even if she played slowly. The little girl had only learned the piano for half a year. Many playing habits that required a lot of practice and accumulation to change still appeared in her. For example, when Shi played the piano, her eyes could not help but look at the piano keys. Shi had already worked hard to develop the habit of playing blindly under her father's request. However, she was still lacking in confidence. Her little head twisted and turned, looking left and right. She looked very serious, but this was also a sign of unprofessionalism. Other than that, she did not know how to grasp the emotions of this song. It was not just "To Alice." Most piano songs had emotional expressions, such as weak, very weak, gradually strong, light, gentle, and so on. However, at Shi's age, it was almost impossible for her to understand so many complicated emotional changes, or what kind of emotional thoughts she should put into it. Therefore, the little girl only played according to the rhythm of her father's playing in her memory, imitating and playing mechanically. In this way, she still had many shortcomings, but Yang Yi was satisfied enough. A 7-year-old girl who could play the piano bravely in public, and even play it fluently, what else could be asked of her? When Shi was playing the piano, Tong finally could not hold back. He broke free from his mother's hand and came closer. His two little hands grabbed the edge of the piano, and he curiously watched his sister play. It was not that he had not seen it before, but the scene today was special. Even Tong felt that his sister had a special glow. This glow attracted the little guy, and he could not help but get closer to his sister. When the passers-by saw this loving scene, they all smiled. Of course, Cici also finished playing very quickly. When she made a gesture to stop, the tourists next to her all laughed and applauded the little girl. Some people even shouted, "Bravo," and cheered loudly. She had just recovered from the world of music when she felt everyone's enthusiasm. This made the little girl a little embarrassed. She was happy and hurriedly got up, rushed to her father, and buried her little head in his arms. "You played very well. Everyone is praising you." Yang Yi smiled and gently patted the little girl's head. He said softly, "Come on, give everyone a bow." She had gone to the concert with her parents before, so she knew what her father meant. The little girl raised her head a little shyly, and her father pulled her forward. They opened their hands and bowed gently to express their gratitude to the people who were smiling kindly. Everyone laughed. Some people were worried that she did not understand English or other foreign languages, so they directly used body language to encourage the little girl, giving her a big thumbs up. However, at this time, the tinkling sound of the piano came from behind them, and it ruined the atmosphere. However, when everyone looked over, they all smiled. It turned out that it was the little girl's younger brother who had curiously pressed on the piano keys. When little Momo realized that her little action had been discovered, she hurriedly retracted her little hand and hid it behind her back. It was as if she was deceiving herself. "Do you want to play the piano too?" Yang Yi asked him with a smile. Tong shook his little head and hid behind his sister in embarrassment. He stuck out his big eyes and looked at his father with a smile. He was smart enough to whisper, "Papa, play." "Papa wants to play too," When she heard this, she was also interested. She held her little brother's little hand and jumped up and down with a smile. Papa doesn't want to play. Yang-yi hurriedly waved his hand. He wanted to keep a low profile. However, the little girl was not satisfied. She pulled her father's hand and pulled him to the piano. She called out in a light and pleasant voice, "Papa wants to play. I want to hear Papa play." Well, Tong Tong, you bad boy, you actually learned how to divert trouble. Chapter 1272. Just as she finished playing the piano, a group of people got off a train that had just stopped at the station. Some of them were carrying musical instruments, while some were empty-handed, but they were all talking and laughing. Among them, there was an Asian face. If Yang-yi saw him, he would definitely recognize him as an acquaintance. However, Yang-yi had no time to pay attention to him, because he was being pestered by his daughter, who wanted him to play the piano once. "We can't hog the piano all the time. Other people want to play it," Yang-yi explained to the little girl helplessly. However, she did not agree. She pouted and protested. "No, Papa, it's not fair. I play the piano, and then you have to play too." We. The little girl was a little speechless, but the onlookers took over she's words and started to jeer. Although the onlookers did not understand the conversation between she and her father, when they saw the little girl pull her father to the piano, they already understood what was going on. As a matter of fact, they all smiled and applauded Yang-yi, and even encouraged him to try with words. Not only were they encouraging him, but they were also very curious about the level of a father who had taught his daughter so well. Yang-yi did not want to be in the limelight, but now he was also unable to refuse the kindness. He smiled helplessly at she, stopped being shy, and sat on the piano stool. Everyone quieted down, just like before, and waited for the performance to start. She was also very happy. She pulled Tong Tong, skipped around to her father's left side, and stood next to the piano. The little girl did not forget to make a shu gesture to her brother. After Yang-yi sat on the piano stool, he pondered for a while, thinking about what song to play. There were a lot of beautiful songs, such as the familiar Flight of the Bumblebee, the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight, and many difficult piano pieces by Franz Liszt. Of course, there was also Maxim's Cubana Cubana. However, Yang-yi did not want to show off his skills. He felt that his purpose of sitting in front of the piano was not to win everyone's applause, but to set a good example for she and even Tong Tong. In this way, the piano piece he had to choose was destined to be rich and colorful in the expression of emotions. Only in this way could it play a good role in guiding she. Secondly, its difficulty could not be too low. Forget about the level of Ode to Alice. Yang-yi did not want to show off his skills, but it did not mean that he wanted to hide his skills. This was meaningless. "I got it. The Crave." Yang-yi thought of this piano piece that appeared in the movie The Pianist at Sea, which he liked very much in his previous life. This song appeared in the plot of the piano duel between 1900 and the founder of jazz, Jerry. In the movie, both Jerry and 1900 played this song, and Jerry played it so well that 1900 was in tears. It was a composition by Jerry in real life, but it was worth mentioning that this was not a song to show off his skills. Although the two of them used it to duel, the real show of their skills started after Jerry said something that made 1900 angry, and then they took out the other songs again. This, The Crave, was a very classic jazz piano piece, and it was also a song that Yang-yi liked very much. The difficulty was not high, but the emotions it expressed were very wonderful. Just like its name, hope, enthusiasm, and the free soul of jazz music, the thoughts it expressed were also positive, and it was very worthy of Yang-yi's performance. It was a long speech, but Yang-yi only thought for a few seconds. He began to raise his other hand, paused slightly, and began to play. At the beginning, the melody was very light, and the surrounding tourists could not help but feel refreshed. Of course, the way Yang-yi pressed the strings with ease, and the smooth and beautiful music that made people feel comfortable listening to it, also made many people in the station who had a certain level of musical literacy stunned. Not simple. Even the station in Leipzig did not have so many professionals, but not being able to play professionally did not mean that they did not know how to appreciate it. Many Europeans had listened to countless concerts since they were young, and their ability to appreciate music was certainly not ordinary. As for the tourists nearby, when they saw Yang Yi's fingers begin to dance, they could deeply feel the power of Yang Yi's piano skills. It was not as fast as playing a song like Flight of the Bumblebee, but Yang Yi's fingers were very light, as if he was not playing the piano, but his fingers were gently dancing with the rhythm, giving people an indescribable feeling of naturalness, smoothness, and softness. The crave was a light piece, and the rhythm of the notes expressed the desire for beauty. As the rhythm jumped, it was as if a relaxed and joyful state was diffusing like the fragrance of flowers, making the audience feel indescribable happiness. And when Yang Yi played, it was precisely this happiness that was expressed. His height was not too conspicuous in the West, but when he played the piano, his body exuded a kind of elegant confidence. His strong face gently swayed, as if expressing the tenderness of the music, and even catering to the characteristics of jazz music. Yang Yi's wantonly twisting body also conveyed a kind of freedom concept. The beauty of music could make people cry, and this did not only exist in novels and movies. Some people who could really understand music could not help but close their eyes and listen to it intoxicatedly. Then, they could not help but feel a little moved, and 2 lines of hot tears would fall from the enthusiast's eyes. Of course, very few people, and no one saw it. Not to mention the other audience members, even Murphy, who was sitting next to their luggage, could not help but close her eyes and listen to it intoxicatedly. She was not moved, only happy and excited. This is my man. The main audience members were Shi and Tong Tong. Tong Tong did not know how to appreciate it, but her sister was enraptured by it. She seemed to be infected by the enthusiasm of the music, and the little girl's face was filled with a sweet smile. Papa played the piano so well. Beautiful music always made people addicted to it, and they even forgot the time. Yang Yi played the entire song for nearly 5 minutes, but after the song was played, some of the audience members were still not satisfied and did not come back to their senses for a long time. Some reacted quickly and gave applause, but it was very sparse, and after a while, it gradually became denser. In the end, everyone in the waiting area stood up and enthusiastically applauded Yang Yi. Yang Yi stood up and bowed to thank everyone. At this time, he was surprised to find that he was surrounded by people, as if everyone in the waiting area had gathered. But Yang Yi played so well that even if he had already thanked everyone still applauded and smiled at him with the most sincere respect. A fat German even praised Yang Yi loudly in German. Yang Yi smiled slightly, cupped his hands in greeting, and thanked him in German. This Asian who can play the piano so well also knows German? Suddenly, Yang Yi received more praise. Mo Fei couldn't help but come up to him and give him a big hug. She also ran up happily and hugged her father with her brother. Papa, you are super awesome. The little girl's little face was red with excitement. Tong Tong, like a parrot, also shouted like her sister, Papa is super awesome. The 2 little guys looked at their father with admiration. Yang Yi suddenly felt that his idea of setting an example for the children had been realized. He smiled, held Murphy's waist, and patted the heads of the 2 little guys with a smile, and said, Then you have to work hard in the future and be as awesome as your father. After a short hustle and bustle, the tourists did not bother too much. They all laughed and rushed to their respective trains. The train station seemed to be quiet again. But at this time, an Asian man in casual clothes with an extraordinary temperament finally found the opportunity to walk up to Yang Yi with a smile. Yang Yi, long time no see. Chapter 1273. How could he meet someone he knew at a train station in Germany on a whim? Yang Yi couldn't believe his eyes. After being stunned for a moment, he finally reacted. However, he was still happy. He opened his arms and hugged the other person. He smiled and said, Teacher Jian, why are you in Leipzig too? Yes, the person who called out to Yang Yi at Leipzig station was Jian Yifan, who had just gotten off the train with his band. Jian Yifan and Yang Yi first met at a coffee shop. P.S. See chapter 236 and 237 for details. At that time, Yang Yi's piano skills were only at a professional level. Jian Yifan was a guest professor at Jiangchuan University and a very famous pianist in the country and abroad. He was the first real piano master that Yang Yi knew. Of course, Jian Yifan was generous with his teachings, which benefited Yang Yi a lot. This was also why Yang Yi respectfully called him Teacher Jian. Later, when Yang Yi was studying at Jiangchuan, he met Jian Yifan again and learned piano from him for a period of time. That was how his skills improved by leaps and bounds, reaching the level he was at today. Yang Yi, I heard your performance just now. Your piano skills have improved quite a lot. Jian Yifan first praised him, then smiled and answered Yang Yi's question. Our band has a performance in Leipzig in 3 days, so we just arrived here. I didn't expect to hear such beautiful music when I passed by the station waiting room. Of course, the two of them were communicating in Mandarin. However, Jian Yifan had brought his band members along, so he couldn't just leave them hanging. At first, Jian Yifan wanted to be Yang Yi's translator. However, later on, he realized that Yang Yi could not only speak English, but could also communicate naturally and fluently in German. As such, he decided to speak German with his band members, which he was more familiar with. Some of Jian Yifan's friends in the band played cello, while others played wind instruments. However, they were very interested in the piece Yang Yi just played. They didn't hear Shi play, and they only heard half of Yang Yi's performance. When they found out that the jazz piano piece was composed by Yang Yi himself, they were all surprised. Haha, let me formally introduce you. This is Yang Yi. Although he's not in the classical music industry, he's a very famous pop musician in China. His wife is also a singer, one of China's top singers. Jian Yifan proudly introduced Yang Yi to his friends. He even introduced Murphy. He's also composed some English songs. Do you still remember Jingle Bells that became popular in the past 2 years? That was also composed by him. Jian Yifan knew Yang Yi quite well. After all, Yang Yi had been in the limelight in the news for the past few years. Even though Jian Yifan rarely paid attention to the pop music industry, he would still take a few glances at his acquaintances in the newspaper. Jian Yifan did not mention Yang Yi's other pop songs. He only mentioned Jingle Bells, because they didn't usually listen to pop music. It was just that they had a performance last Christmas, and after the performance, they gathered together to improvise this song, so they were more familiar with it. Jingle Bells was also written by Yang Yi. The few Westerners in the band widened their eyes in surprise. Yang Yi smiled slightly. He was not overly modest in front of these people. He calmly replied, "My English name is Leon." This instantly caused them to sigh with emotion. When she saw so many foreigners appear, she was a little nervous and snuggled into her mother's arms. She was very curious about what her father was talking about with them. However, even her mother could not understand their conversation. The little girl could only blink her big eyes in confusion. When she saw these people exclaim, she seemed to feel her father's excellence. Unknowingly, the little girl felt very proud. Of course, no matter how great Yang Yi's achievements in the pop music industry were, after all, they were not working in the same field. A few exclamations were enough. What was left was for Yang Yi to have a simple exchange with them about the music just now. After that, Jian Yifan wanted to invite Yang Yi and his family to watch their band's performance. Unfortunately, Jian Yifan's performance was 3 days later. Yang Yi's family did not have that much time to stay. It was not a problem for the train to be rescheduled. Yang Yi did not lack the money. However, the problem was that Yang Yi wanted to bring Murphy and the children back to China after touring Paris. If they went straight back to Onqing, they could at least make it back in time for the Chinese New Year. Therefore, this time, he could only regretfully decline. After a short meeting, Jian Yifan and his band did not stay for long. They hurriedly carried their instruments to the hotel they were staying at. The waiting hall of the train station returned to its usual peace. No one was sitting in front of the piano playing music. Yang Yi and Murphy also brought the children back to their seats and sat down. They patiently waited for the train that would arrive in less than an hour. I didn't expect to meet Teacher Jen here, Murphy said to Yang Yi with emotion. Yeah, I know that he often performs in Vienna, Austria. This time, he was probably invited to Leipzig, Yang Yi said to Murphy with a smile. Teacher Jen's mental state is still very good. I can't tell that he's almost 60 years old at all, Murphy said with admiration. The two were bored waiting for the train, so they chatted casually. Shi's eyes darted around. She had been holding it in for a long time. Finally, there was a small pause in the conversation between her parents. Then, she hurriedly interrupted. Papa, let me tell you. Just now, when I was playing the piano, I played it wrong at the beginning. She burrowed into her father's arms and snuggled up to him, directly taking over his body. Papa knows, the one you played. Yang Yi smiled and directly listed all the mistakes to Shi. Oh. Papa, don't talk about this. I'm not talking about this. The little girl shook her but shyly and pouted her small mouth, saying, I thought everyone would laugh at me, but they didn't, so I wasn't afraid. Why would they laugh at you? You played very well. Yang Yi smiled and rubbed the little girl's head. With she chatting together, time always passed quickly. After a while, their train arrived. Murphy held Tong, who was already sleepy in her mother's arms, and Yang Yi carried the luggage bag and pulled Shi onto the train to warmer Paris. Originally, it was a very happy day, but for some reason, after getting on the train, Yang Yi began to feel a little absent-minded. After he arranged for Murphy and the children to rest in the carriage, he took the thermos out of the dining car to get hot water. Through the window, the city lights still illuminated the night sky. However, there seemed to be a mass of dark clouds covering the southwest sky. Did he see it wrong? Chapter 1274. When the train arrived in Paris, it was already the next morning. The sky outside the window had just begun to brighten, but the sky was very blue. A few white clouds floated lazily in the sky. It seemed a little different from the serious air pollution in Paris that was reported in the news. In fact, the smog in Paris was different from that in Beijing. It was also polluted, but the blue sky could still be seen from the ground. However, Yang Yi still secretly heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the blue sky. Where are the dark clouds? He wondered if there was something wrong with his senses yesterday. However, no matter whether there was a problem or not, Yang Yi was still careful and secretly vigilant. This was his habit in his previous life. It was also a lesson he learned after being secretly photographed by LVU in this life. He had re-established his vigilance. However, Yang Yi did not show it. He still laughed and looked at Murphy and the children's dance. When they got up in the carriage, Murphy was in a very good mood. She woke up Shi and Tong and started to dance the samba happily. She also sang, Come to Paris, buy a dress. Come to Paris, buy a bag. Come to Paris, buy shoes. She was so happy that she was like a 3-year-old child who had never seen the world. Mo Fei's happiness also infected the two little guys who had just woken up and were still rubbing their eyes with a confused look on their faces. Cece's two little hands were intertwined, and she stretched forward. Her small body could also be pressed into a beautiful curve. Then she looked at her mother and giggled. She even laughed so hard that her little brother fell to the ground. The train had already arrived at the station, so Yang Yi and Murphy simply tidied up the two little guys and got off the train together. Let's go to the hotel first, take a shower, change our clothes, and then go shopping. Murphy walked in front excitedly and ordered. Don't worry, we still have luggage. Yang Yi did not know whether to laugh or cry and stopped Murphy. This little guy wanted to go shopping. Oh, that's right. Murphy retracted her footsteps in embarrassment. However, although Mo Fei was too impatient today, Cece liked her mother very much. Just now, the little girl was also very happy to be with her mother. She waved her hands and walked in front of her mother with a straight step. It was rare for Shi to be in sync with her mother. It was not difficult to collect the luggage. Yang Yi and the others came to the front of the luggage cart and handed over the receipt. Soon, the staff brought down the 2 suitcases for Yang Yi and the others. However, while waiting for the luggage, Yang Yi's ears twitched and he noticed a trace of movement. He looked into the distance and saw a few figures hiding behind a parked freight train in the distance. Of course, from Yang Yi's angle, he could not see those people. However, Yang Yi's eyes were very sharp. He could vaguely see the ankles and calves that were exposed through the gaps under the car. Thieves! Yang Yi guessed secretly. It should be. They came so early, probably waiting for the staff to not notice, and then secretly steal some of the goods in the freight train. However, Yang Yi did not intend to be a hero. He did not have the heart to be a hero in the first place. Now that he had his wife and children, it was better to avoid unnecessary trouble. So, Yang Yi only took a glance, then retracted his gaze. He took his 2 suitcases as if nothing had happened, thanked the staff, and left with Murphy and the others. However, before he left, Yang Yi took the opportunity to glance in that direction again. A face flashed past, and a pair of gloomy eyes fell into his line of sight. Yang Yi had already turned around. He smiled and gestured for Cici and the others to sit on the trolley. Then, he pushed the 2 little fellows forward. However, the vicious look in his eyes still remained in his memory. Faintly, Yang Yi felt a little uneasy. When they returned to the crowded train station, the noisy and lively atmosphere drove away a little of the haze in Yang Yi's heart. After all, this was Paris, an international metropolis and the transportation hub of Europe. Even in the morning, there were still many people at the train station. Regardless of whether they had gathered from all over the world or were preparing to leave by train, the huge train station was filled to the brim. Yang Yi smiled and joked with Shi and Tong Tong. Okay, we're going to get on the escalator. Passengers who have arrived at the station, please get off. Shi was amused by her father. She giggled and even grabbed the handle of the luggage. She said mischievously to her father, passengers who have arrived at the station don't get off, hee. Tong Tong didn't know whether he understood or not, but he felt that the conversation between his sister and his father was very interesting. He imitated his sister and hugged the handle. He giggled and said, I'm not getting off, I'm not getting off. Yang Yi helplessly patted Shishi's head and said with a smile, okay, seriously, get off. It's not safe to sit on the escalator like this. Shishi, be a good role model for your little brother. Shishi didn't really want to be lazy. The little girl was very obedient. She stepped back and jumped down from the luggage. After all, the advantage of having long legs was greater. Little brother, get off too. She was very eager to help. She wrapped her arms around the handle and hugged Tong Tong's armpits from the front. You're not getting off. Tong Tong muttered. However, his mouth didn't match his heart. He leaned over and hugged his sister's neck to let her carry him down. You're so heavy. Little brother, you've gained weight again. She yelled as she carried Tong Tong down. Tong Tong giggled with his sister and rubbed his hands on his body in embarrassment. However, after they got on the escalator, she suddenly turned around and pulled her father's hand. She said weakly, Papa, I want to go to the bathroom. That's right. The little girl woke up in the morning and wanted to get off in a hurry. Me too. I want to pee too. Tong Tong openly acted like a hooligan. He stuck out his little belly and said in a clear voice after his sister, You want to go to the bathroom? Yang Yi looked at the entrance of the bus station in front of them. He pondered for a moment and said, Then let's go back to the waiting hall. It's not easy to find a bathroom outside. Also, I don't know if there will be a traffic jam if we take a taxi to the hotel. Murphy smiled and said, That's a good idea. By the way, we can take out a towel and wipe Shi and Tong Tong's faces. They haven't washed their faces and brushed their teeth since they woke up this morning. After making a happy decision, Yang Yi led Murphy and the children down the escalator. There were quite a lot of toilets in such a big train station. However, because Cici and little Momo wanted to wash their faces and brush their teeth, Yang Yi simply took them to the most remote toilet. This was the passage leading to the staff. Not to mention that there was no one in the toilet, there were usually very few passengers who came here in a hurry. Go in with Mama. Papa will be outside. I'll take care of your luggage. Yang Yi opened his carry-on luggage and took out a towel, a toothbrush, and other toiletries for Murphy. Then, he smiled at Shi and Tong Tong. Tong Tong was too young. It was fine for a 2-year-old boy to go to the ladies' room. However, she could not go to the men's room. Yang Yi was on guard. Murphy led the 2 children into the restroom while laughing and chatting happily. Yang Yi stayed outside and guarded the 2 suitcases. However, when Yang Yi scanned the waiting hall out of habit, he made an unexpected discovery. Yang Yi's gaze fell on the people in grey windbreakers who stood in groups of 2s and 3s around the public telephones. He faintly felt that something was wrong. Why are there so many people dressed like this? The haze in Yang Yi's heart, which had been suppressed by him, suddenly shrouded him again. Chapter 1275. Seeing such a scene, Yang Yi suddenly felt a sense of danger. But before he could identify it, an electric scooter driven by a cleaner in the station entered his sight. Coincidentally, the scooter was parked next to the 2 men in grey windbreakers. Did they realize something was wrong? Yang Yi creased his eyebrows. But soon, Yang Yi saw that on the electric scooter, someone lifted the curtain and handed 2 long black bags to the 2 men in grey windbreakers. The 2 men in grey windbreakers took the opportunity to hide the bags in their windbreakers. Their movements were so fast that only Yang Yi could see it clearly. F***ck. Yang Yi suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body. Looking at the shape of the bulging bags, Yang Yi could guess what was inside. Could it be? Coincidentally, the electric scooter turned around, and Yang Yi's gaze fell on the faces of the 2 men in the cleaner's uniform on the scooter. They had black hair and yellow skin, but unlike East Asians, their faces were more 3-dimensional and curvaceous. Their eyebrows were well defined, and their noses were high. They looked a bit like Caucasians. But even without their signature sideburns, Yang Yi could still recognize them. F***ck. Why are these lunatics here? Yang Yi thought anxiously. Yang Yi was very familiar with these people in his previous life, but that was only when he was carrying out a mission. After all, wealth comes from danger. But if it were not for the mission, Yang Yi would not have wanted to provoke them. The electric scooter was still turning around, and Yang Yi also saw the eyes of the other person sitting in the passenger seat. Although there was no contact between the pair of malicious eyes, it was enough to make Yang Yi shudder. It's him. Yang Yi had seen this pair of eyes before, just behind the freight train. One-on-one, Yang Yi was not afraid of these guys at all. Even if he could not handle them, he could easily escape. But now, Yang Yi was no longer a lone wolf. He still had the comfort of his family on his shoulders. When Yang Yi thought of Murphy, Shi, and Tong Tong who were still washing up in the bathroom, his heart sank. Damn it. Why didn't these people go to Stockholm? Why did he come to Paris? Of course, Yang Yi also knew why. If it were him, he wouldn't have chosen to attack the heavily guarded Stockholm either. It would have been better if they had just gone out directly. As long as they got into the taxi, whatever happened at the train station behind them, whether it was a flood or a landslide, it had nothing to do with them. She shouldn't have suggested going to the toilet at the station. Or perhaps they should not have stayed in Leipzig yesterday. If the train had not stopped yesterday, they would have arrived in Paris last night, and today they would have been shopping instead of appearing here. Of course, regret wouldn't solve the problem. Yang Yi quickly calmed down. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his vision became much sharper. Can we still go out at this time? Yang Yi's brain started to calculate precisely like a computer. He turned his head to look at the station door at the top of the escalator in the distance, thinking about how long it would take for him to bring Murphy and the children out without any luggage and without alerting the enemy. But soon, Yang Yi's heart sank again. This was because he saw the men in grey coats start to move. Yang Yi temporarily ignored the movements of the others. He could clearly see that there were about 3 groups of 6 people, and they seemed to be casually getting on the escalator. They want to block the door. It's too late. Yang Yi saw that the men on the escalator had started to lift up their coats and take out their black cloth bags. When they were about to take out their weapons, he closed his eyes, turned around, and walked resolutely to the ladies' room. When he opened the door of the ladies' room, the sound of gunshots rang out like firecrackers during the New Year. The screams were still a little slow, but Yang Yi had already pushed his suitcase into the ladies' room. After he closed the door, all the noise outside seemed to have been blocked outside. The 2 little guys had finished brushing their teeth. Murphy was wiping Tong Tong's face, and she was standing next to them, secretly laughing. When she saw her father come in, she mischievously screamed, "Ah, Papa, you can't come in. This is the ladies' room." When Tong Tong heard the noise, she couldn't help but push away her mother's hand and towel. She looked at her father and giggled. Yang Yi's face was cold at first, but when he saw the 2 children, he couldn't help but soften a little. He squeezed out a smile, rubbed Shishi's little head, and said with a smile, "There's no one else here. What are you afraid of?" However, Yang Yi didn't have time to play with the children. He first got into a cubicle, stepped on the toilet, and reached out to push the top of the cubicle. "What's going on?" Murphy was still smiling and wanted to ask Yang Yi why he came in, but when she saw Yang Yi's actions, she suddenly froze. After a while, she realized that something was wrong, so she quickly walked over and asked. Although the top of the cubicle could be removed, the space inside was very narrow. It was usually used by repairmen to repair the circuit, so there was no way to hide. However, there was still a way. Yang Yi changed to another cubicle and used the multifunction key in his hand to unscrew the screw of the air vent. Fortunately, because the station was relatively large, it required a good ventilation design. Therefore, even though it was a cubicle, the air vent was designed to be very large. The air vent was 600 mm x 600 mm square, and the air duct was 800 mm x 600 mm, which was enough to allow an adult of a normal size to crawl in. Of course, it was possible to crawl in, but it was impossible to crawl from the air duct to other places like in the movies. After all, there were other devices blocking the air ducts. Moreover, Yang Yi didn't know if the air duct would fall down as he crawled. Something happened outside. "There's a KBFZ. There's no time to explain. Listen to my arrangements. Don't worry, as long as I'm here, nothing will happen to you," Yang Yi whispered into Murphy's ear. At this time, Murphy obviously knew what Yang Yi was talking about. Her eyes suddenly revealed a panicked expression. She was just an ordinary person, so how could she not be afraid? Murphy's eyes turned red, and she bit her lower lip tightly. She was afraid that she would cry out in fear and frighten the 2 children. However, she was really panicking, and her whole body was weak. She could only hold on to Yang Yi's arm and try her best to support herself. "Don't panic. You still have children." Murphy tried her best to remind herself that she had to be strong for the children. Yang Yi looked at Murphy's expression and deliberately smiled casually. He said, "Don't worry, your husband is so powerful. I've seen all kinds of big situations. I promise that I'll bring you out of danger." "Really?" Murphy looked at Yang Yi pitifully. At this moment, she only had Yang Yi as her support. "It's true." Yang Yi nodded firmly. Although Yang Yi was whispering in Murphy's ear, he did not dare to relax at all. He placed the 2 suitcases on top of each other and stacked them on top of each other on top of the toilet bowl under the air vent. "Come on, honey, you climb up first, and then I'll bring Shi and Tong Tong up. You take them to hide inside first." Yang Yi estimated that those people in gray trench coats would take some time to control the situation, so they would not be able to take care of them for the time being. However, Yang Yi did not dare to delay and began to make arrangements. I don't have any strength." Murphy gritted her teeth and persisted. She took off her high-heeled shoes and climbed up the suitcase with the help of Yang Yi. However, her body was trembling and she could not stand steadily. With tears in her eyes, she whispered to Yang Yi with a sobbing tone, "Papa, what is Mom doing?" Shi and Tong Tong curiously stood by the side and looked at their parents in confusion. "We're playing a little game." Yang Yi asked Murphy to hold on to the toilet's partition. With a leap, he also sat on top of the partition. Then, he took the time to turn his head and smiled at Shi. He pretended to be relaxed and said. At this time, Yang Yi's terrifying arm strength finally came in handy. He bent down and clamped Murphy's slender waist with both hands. With a gentle hug, he lifted Murphy up. This was enough for half of Murphy's body to reach into the pipe. "Wow! Papa is so awesome." She stood below and looked up with a face full of admiration. She praised as if she was watching an acrobatic performance. Tong Tong looked at his sister and then looked at Mom, who was trying her best to climb inside. He pouted and said, but, Mom is also super awesome." Perhaps because she heard the children's praise, Murphy's body, which had been paralyzed with fear, surged with strength and she tried her best to climb up. Fortunately, the air pipe and the ceiling of the station were very stable and did not shake at all. The quality of foreign construction was indeed incomparable to that of domestic construction. "Sit here first. Later, I'll let Shi and the others go in from here. Then, I'll hold you and let you climb through," Yang Yi explained. He jumped down from the toilet partition. Now, he had a few words to say to Shi. Yang Yi squatted down and pulled the red string from Shi's and Tong Tong's necks. He took out the Buddha statue that he had made for them before and let the two little guys hold it in their hands. Then, he hugged Tong Tong with his left hand and Shi with his right hand and gently kissed their little faces. "Shi, I want you to help me with the game we're playing today," Yang Yi said softly as he looked at the side of his daughter's smiling face, who made his heart filled with tenderness. Yes, Yang Yi had already made up his mind. Unless there was no way to hide it, Yang Yi would stand in front of the children like an indestructible barrier. Not only would he shelter them from the wind and rain, but he would also not let the storm outside leave a trace in their young hearts. Even if the smart she could guess it, as long as she did not see it, Yang Yi was not worried that it would affect the little girl's mental health. "Okay, Papa, what do you want me to help with?" She blinked her big watery eyes and asked her father in a clear voice. Chapter 1276. Because we're going to play a game of hide and seek today. You have to help me hide in the pipe above. You also have to help me take good care of your brother. Don't let him be afraid, don't cry, and don't talk too loudly, okay? Yang Yi's ears were pricked up, and he spoke a little fast. After the door was closed, the gunshots outside became very faint, and Shi and the others did not feel anything. However, Yang Yi could still tell if someone was approaching. Just now, there was chaos in the staff area. Not only were there gunshots, but there were also screams. It was very noisy, and Yang Yi was very worried. Fortunately, no one had approached them for the time being, probably because it was too remote. Hearing her father's words, the smart little girl still felt that something was wrong. Her delicate little eyebrows slightly wrinkled, and she hesitantly muttered, Then. But. She took a step closer, snuggled her little body into her father's arms, hugged her father's neck with two small hands, pouted her little mouth, and whispered, "But Papa, I'm scared too." For some reason, the little girl was very nervous. Maybe she also felt the danger from her parents' expressions. However, at this time, the little boy next to them giggled. Tong Tong did not feel anything, and thought that his father was going to play a fun game. He puffed out his little chest, waved his two little hands, and shouted excitedly, "Don't be scared, don't be scared." "Sure." Yang Yi quickly put up a finger to signal Tong Tong to be quiet. He pricked up his ears, and after confirming that there was still no movement outside, he said to Shi, "We are just playing a game. What is there to be scared of? Also, isn't your father always here?" Shi looked at her father, hesitated for a while, and then reluctantly nodded. Yang Yi smiled and let Shi hold up the Buddha statue in her hands. After he adjusted the volume for the little girl, he removed the earphones from the back of the Buddha statue and put them on the little girl. The current Buddha statue was no longer the original model. Since Yang Yi had nothing to do in the past 2 years, he had modified it to make it more exquisite. For example, this kind of equipment that could be inserted into the Buddha statue could be used as a miniature loudspeaker and could be taken out as an earphone. This took a lot of Yang Yi's time and effort. But it was definitely useful. In a situation like this, using earphones could reduce the risk of being discovered if the sound suddenly came out. "Do you still remember how Daddy taught you how to use this thing?" Yang Yi said softly. "Press it gently like this and you'll be able to talk." She looked at her father in confusion, but she still nodded. Yang Yi also took out a wireless earphone and stuffed it into his ear. Then, he opened the GPS program of these Buddha statues on his phone and waved his phone at Shi. "You'll be up there later. If there's anything you want to report to Daddy, you can use this to tell Daddy. Daddy will be down there. Then, we'll be like playing a spy game. Secretly, don't let anyone find out, okay?" Yang Yi knew that the current situation was a big challenge for Shi, but at this time, he could only hope that Shi could be strong. He gently rubbed the little girl's head, looked at Shi with anticipation, and said softly, "Help Daddy take care of your little brother. Let's play this game together, okay?" The little girl looked weak and helpless now, but she still held her father's finger, pouted her little mouth, and nodded gently. "Remember Daddy's words, Shi. If it's inconvenient for Daddy to respond when you ask Daddy, don't worry. Daddy will gently tap 3 times like this." Yang Yi's finger tapped the phone's microphone 3 times gently. He smiled at Shi and said, "You don't have to worry, because this means that Daddy has already told you that Daddy heard what you said. Wait a moment and I'll give you an answer." Shi's rosy little mouth was slightly open. The little girl, who was usually talkative, did not know what to say at this moment. She could only nod foolishly. Yang Yi reminded her of a few more things to take note of, then deliberately revealed a hearty smile. He gently clapped his hands and said, "Okay, let's play this game together." He first picked up Shi and stuffed her into the ventilation duct with her face facing the outside. Fortunately, because it was winter, the air conditioning system was not turned on. It was just a normal ventilation system, so it was not very cold inside. However, Yang Yi still gave Shi and Tong an extra jacket in advance. "Daddy." In the duct, the little girl's eyes were sparkling, but they seemed to be a little misty. The rims of her eyes were red, and she called out softly, "It's okay. Everything will be fine." Yang Yi smiled and gave the little girl a thumbs up, asking her to crawl a little further inside. After that, it was Tong's turn. After Yang Yi stuffed the little guy into the duct, he pinched Tong's nose and said with a smile, "Now that we're playing the game, we can't talk loudly or cry, okay? TSK, Daddy believes that you're a man, and you're also very good." Tong was not afraid at all. He was in the mood to play, so he just shrunk his neck, dodged his father's big hand, and then giggled with his father. After that, Yang Yi also sent Murphy to the children's side. Murphy was already trying hard to hold back her tears. Just now, when she was in the duct, she could clearly hear the gunshots outside. She already knew that Yang Yi was telling the truth, and she was even more afraid. You're not coming up?" Murphy asked hurriedly when she saw Yang Yi pick up the back cover of the air duct and was about to install it after he carried her over. "I'll watch from below. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." As Yang Yi spoke, he stretched out his hand and pulled out the Buddha statue from Murphy's neck, indicating that she should put on the headphones. In such a hurry, it was already good that Yang Yi was considerate, and it was inevitable that he would be flustered. But, hubby, When Murphy heard that Yang Yi wanted to protect them, she was touched and worried at the same time. She was so anxious that tears rolled down her cheeks, and she softly choked with sobs. "Don't cry, you won't look good if you continue to cry." Yang Yi was still in the mood to joke. He stuffed Murphy's head back into the duct and smiled, "Don't worry, your hubby is powerful. My skills are not comparable to those small fries outside. I'll be down there, so I can adapt to the situation. But, I don't want you. Don't fight with them, okay? Murphy thought that Yang Yi wanted to get rid of the evil for the people, so she pitifully begged. After all, Yang Yi's previous identity was an upright and plain-spoken soldier. But how could Murphy know that Yang Yi had never thought of risking his life, and he did not have the righteousness of his predecessor? The current him was very realistic, and considered everything very carefully. If it were not for the people he loved the most in danger, Yang Yi would never act rashly. How could it be so easy to be a hero? There were countless people in grey coats outside, and they were all lunatics with guns. Yang Yi was not stupid enough to think that he could not be killed like Ultraman, and that he could turn the tide and save the world. He had a mortal body, and a bullet could knock him down. Moreover, Yang Yi knew that if he fell, Murphy and the children would be exposed to danger. Therefore, no matter what, Yang Yi couldn't risk the lives of himself and his loved ones for a group of people who had nothing to do with him. Wasn't it the police's job to catch the bad guys? Don't worry, I won't be a hero. I will just stay here and protect you. Yang Yi comforted her softly. After he comforted Murphy, he began to use the multifunction key ring to screw up the air vent cover. After the cover was closed, the bathroom seemed to become quiet again. Yang Yi's eyes became sharp again. He looked around, and his head was spinning quickly. Yang Yi had already thought about it. First of all, he could not stay in the women's bathroom, because he would get too little information about the outside world. Moreover, this kind of defense was very passive, and the risk was very high. It would be best if he hid outside, and as long as someone approached the bathroom, he would take action and nip the danger in the bud. But before he went out, Yang Yi felt that he had to find a suitable weapon first. Yang Yi's most powerful weapon was his knife skills, followed by various assassination weapons and guns. Of course, now that he had integrated the kung fu of this body, his close combat ability could not be underestimated, but after all, the opponent had a gun. But, where could he find a weapon? In Europe, he had to go through all kinds of security checks. Besides a 2 to 3 centimeters long spike on his key ring, he had nothing else. Chapter 1277. It would be great if he had a knife. With a knife, Yang Yi's confidence could be raised to the point of arrogance. But this was just wishful thinking. In the toilet of the train station, where could he find a knife? Yang Yi's eyes wandered around the only 2 trolley boxes. He was thinking about whether to remove the trolley bars, but even if he removed them, they would not be sharp enough. He did not have more time to polish them. However, when he thought of the word sharp, Yang Yi thought of something. He opened the zipper of the suitcase and took out a beautifully packaged wooden box. After opening it, a pair of exquisitely carved crystal high heels appeared in his hands, sparkling under the light. That's right, it was the pair of crystal high heels that Murphy had bought when she was shopping with Maria in Göteborg. They could only be admired as a piece of art. Not to mention how expensive the material of this pair of high heels was, the shape of the heels was more than 15 centimeters high. Moreover, the heels were very thin and sharp. If he was stepped on by this pair of high heels, forget it, let's not think about it. Yang Yi now had his eyes on this pair of high heels, which were 18 centimeters long. Obviously, with such a length, slender and sharp, in the hands of an expert like Yang Yi, it was enough to be used as a military knife. Honey, I'm sorry. Later, I'll buy you 10 more pairs of crystal high heels. Yang Yi said in his heart. He exerted strength in his hands and directly broke the shoe into 2 pieces from the waist of the shoe. In this way, he could still hold the smooth and round upper part of the heel and exert strength. If this long sharp thorn were to pierce down at a relatively fast speed, it would be fatal. After making a military knife, Yang Yi put the remaining half of the shoe and the other intact crystal high heel back into the box. After tidying up and stuffing the trolley box into the innermost compartment, Yang Yi prepared to go out and investigate the situation. Before going out, Yang Yi whispered to Murphy through the headset, "All right, I'll go out and take a look. Don't worry, I'll be fine." Murphy's voice was very soft as it came through the earpiece. In order not to worry Yang-yi, she suppressed her urge to cry and said softly, You have to be careful too. When Yang-yi pushed open the door, he carefully used Murphy's mirror to look around. However, when he really walked out, he could feel the completely different atmosphere and the smell of blood outside. Yang-yi realized that all the cells in his body were trembling. It wasn't nervousness or fear. It was excitement. Are you thirsting for battle? Yang-yi said to himself in his heart. However, he remained calm and reminded himself, Don't forget that you are no longer alone. You are no longer alone in this world. Yang-yi avoided the location of the surveillance cameras. This was his habit. Every time he went to a place, he would look around and remember the location and angle of all the surveillance cameras. After walking out of the toilet for some distance, Yang-yi hid behind a potted plant and used the mirror to secretly check the situation outside. Just as Yang-yi had guessed, the waiting hall of the station was in a mess. All the tourists and station staff were detained here. Moreover, whether it was in the hall or upstairs, there were gunmen in gray coats watching over them. There are about 18 people here. However, there should be some people who are hiding somewhere. Yang-yi counted silently. This was not a movie. There were still some people lying in a pool of blood on the ground. Looking at their clothes, some of them were station guards, some of them were station staff, and some of them were tourists. Quite a number of them died, but there were still some who were struggling and crying out in pain. Because of this, some people mustered up their courage and foolishly walked toward the men in gray. Although the station was filled with cries, screams, and noises, and it was difficult for Yang-yi to hear what they were talking about, judging from their gestures, these silly people were trying to ask the executioners to rescue the wounded who were still struggling. Yang-yi's expression was as cold as it was in his previous life, but he sighed in his heart. How naive. Don't get yourself involved. Perhaps Yang-yi would still be so cold that he would not sacrifice his own life and that of his family for these people. However, after living as an ordinary person for the past few years, he still had the compassion of an ordinary person. Seeing that the war did not spread to his side, Yang-yi took out his mobile phone and checked the news about today's incident. He had to say that the Western TV and media reports were really impressive. Yang-yi sent people to set up a foreign version of micro-broadcasting and Facebook. The official media accounts above were also constantly following up on the progress of the incident. XXXX took hostages at the Paris train station and shouted at the French and American presidents to ask for the release of 1,000 felons from Island X. Yang-yi saw this and sighed in his heart. Sure enough, they are not easy to deal with. How can I be so unlucky to encounter the most difficult group of tough bones in the world? There were also moving pictures. Yang-yi could see that the train station was surrounded by the French military and police. The media's helicopters were also hovering around, but due to the brutality of the men in gray, no one took action for the time being. There are so many hostages. If they were to rescue them, wouldn't there be countless casualties? Yang-yi pondered. The felons from Island X, those people will definitely not be released. It can only depend on the police and these people to see who will win. But Yang-yi remembered that in his previous life, he heard about an attack on a certain opera house in this city. Even if the attacker was killed, in the chaos, hundreds of hostages were killed. Yang-yi thought about it. No matter what, he could not let Murphy and the children out. But at this moment, suddenly a burst of fierce gunshots echoed in the large space of the station. Yang-yi was startled and withdrew his thoughts. Sure enough, the men in gray were impatient with those righteous people. They directly picked up the automatic rifle in their arms and fired at the ceiling. There was another burst of screaming and crying in the station, but fortunately, Yang-yi saw that those people were just scared to the ground. The man in gray who fired the gun did not shoot at them. However, this barrage of gunfire made the gray-robed men even more arrogant, and they all laughed out loud. These men in gray were still organized. Someone shouted a few times from upstairs, and their laughter calmed down. Yang-yi could understand what they were saying. Yang-yi could basically understand the Semitic language. But then, the station's broadcast suddenly rang. This time, the person who spoke was in English, and the message was to warn the hostages to obediently lie on the ground and listen to their orders. But Yang Yi could still hear that this person's tone was very calm, and he had the demeanor of a commander. Did the important person of these people go to the station's control center? Yang Yi thought to himself, and a pair of malicious eyes appeared in his mind. He should be there too, right? Could it be the person who spoke just now? Yang Yi was not interested in exploring this question. He held his phone and continued to pay attention to the leaked negotiations on the media. As long as I don't go near the toilet, how you fight has nothing to do with me, Yang Yi thought to himself. But even if Yang Yi wanted to stay out of it, others wanted to rub the fur on his lion's head. All of a sudden, two men in gray walked towards him with guns in their hands. They were talking to each other as they walked towards him. Damn you! Chapter 1278. At this moment, in the air duct of the women's toilet, Mo Fei was cautiously poking her head out and looking outside through the circular fence. But it was empty below, and there was no movement at all. This made Murphy even more anxious. However, compared to the silent Murphy, Tong Tong was completely oblivious to what was happening outside. The little guy thought that he was participating in an interesting game. Tong Tong kept moving his little butt between his mother and big sister. Then, he blinked his big round eyes and looked at his big sister, secretly laughing to himself. You can't laugh. She could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't know what was going on. She only knew that the little girl's heart was filled with sadness. Now that Tong Tong was laughing, she remembered her father's advice and whispered to Tong Tong. In front of her, Mo Fei finally couldn't hold it in anymore. She pressed the Buddha statue hanging on her neck up and down. The head of the Buddha statue drilled into the big belly, but this way, they could still talk. Mo Fei whispered, "Hello, how's it going over there?" She spoke very softly, as though she was afraid that her voice would be heard. However, there was no response from the earpiece, so Murphy started to panic. No, nothing must have happened. Maybe the earpiece is broken. Yes, it must be because the weather in Sweden is too cold. Murphy muttered to herself as she tried to find an excuse. But Mo Fei's eyes couldn't help but turn red. There were tears rolling down her cheeks, but she was biting her lower lip tightly. However, at this moment, there was a sound coming from the earpiece. It wasn't Yang Yi's voice. Instead, it was 3 slow and light knocks. What was that? Murphy was dumbfounded. Actually, she heard Yang Yi talking about it, but it was too urgent. Yang Yi only talked to Shi and forgot to tell Murphy the secret signal. As a result, Mo Fei's mind was now blank. She couldn't remember that she had heard the conversation between Yang Yi and CC on the pipeline just now. Fortunately, Yang Yi's reply was sent out at the same time, so she could hear it. The little girl was stunned for a moment before she whispered, Papa said that he can't talk until later." Really? There was a rustling sound. Murphy turned around with difficulty and looked at her daughter. Her eyes were filled with hope as she whispered, "Really? Papa said, 3 times, and then he will talk to us later." Cece seriously raised 3 slender white fingers and said to her mother. Murphy breathed a sigh of relief, but soon she felt that Yang Yi should be in trouble, so he didn't respond in time. Therefore, Murphy's heart was in her mouth again. She quickly shushed Shi and signaled her not to talk. Tong Tong was caught in the middle. She looked left and right with a blank face. Yes, Yang Yi was preparing to attack the 2 men in gray who were coming over. He had already pulled out his army knife, high-heeled shoes, from his waist. However, just as he leaned out of the potted plant, Murphy's voice suddenly came from his headset. He was worried that Murphy would get into an accident if he didn't respond, so he had to go back first. He took out his mobile phone and made a simple secret signal. Then, he plugged his mobile phone and turned off the sound of his headset. His eyes became sharp again. But before he started the car again, Yang Yi's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the surveillance camera that the 2 men in gray had just passed by. His mind spun quickly, and in the end, he chose to put the heels of his high heels back on his waist. Yang Yi's figure silently appeared from behind the potted plant. He quietly approached along the edge of the potted plant where the surveillance camera couldn't capture him. It was as if he had returned to the bloody world. The survival skills that Yang Yi had imprinted in his soul bloomed again. Moreover, although he was used to living a comfortable life, he had never relaxed his self-cultivation. With his perfect physical fitness, Yang Yi felt that he could move stealthily more smoothly than in his previous life. He was like a ghost, hiding in the air. Even though he had already walked behind the two men, they still didn't notice him and were still talking. Yang Yi could understand the Semitic language. From their conversation, Yang Yi knew that although they were already men of sacrifice, they had not completely become killing machines that could be controlled by others. They still had their own emotions. They were angrily talking about their loved ones who had died in the war. They compared the number of white people that they had shot to death, venting their inner hatred without restraint. Yang Yi had already snuck up behind them. He could even avoid the lights that might give him away because of his shadow. Perhaps you have hatred in your hearts, but I'm sorry, I won't allow you to vent your hatred here, Yang Yi thought to himself as he listened to their words. At the same time, Yang Yi's two open hands flashed out like a fox's shadow, causing the air to fluctuate. The two gray-clothed men seemed to have sensed something, but they only raised their eyelids before suddenly twisting their heads. Muffled cracking sounds rang out at the same time. The vigor that represented vitality gradually faded from their eyes, and the gloominess of death quietly covered them. Yang Yi's palms were still covering their mouths. His strong arms supported the two heavy bodies that were powerlessly sliding down. Although he had killed 2 lives, Yang Yi's expression was calm. He was neither happy nor sad, let alone excited. These people, other than using guns to attack civilians, were actually just ordinary people. Yang Yi could fight all of them alone with his bare hands. Wasn't it just killing 2 small fries? What was there to be excited about? For the time being, the crisis was resolved. Yang Yi first moved the 2 guys into the men's toilet and carefully put them down. Because they had directly twisted their cervical vertebrae, causing damage to their medulla oblongata and spine, Yang Yi did not leave any traces behind. Now, when he dealt with the 2 bodies, he had to be careful not to leave any traces of himself. For example, he had to erase any fingerprints that he might have left behind. His computer-like brain started working again. Now, it seems that the possibility of successfully avoiding danger with Murphy and the children is higher. Then, I can consider the next problem. Yang Yi searched the bodies of the 2 dead men while pondering, how can I separate myself from Murphy and the children? Yang Yi really did not want to be a hero. Even if it was just letting the police know that he had killed 2 KBFZ members, it would not do. Once the media publicized it, he would become a thorn in the side of these lunatics. Yang Yi didn't want these people to target him or his family. While he was still thinking about it, he had an unexpected gain from looting the bodies. In addition to 2 rifles and some magazines, Yang Yi also found a Gurkha scimitar with a leather sheath on the waist of one of the dead men. There is such a good item? Yang Yi was delighted. Actually, he did not like to use this kind of scimitar. Although it was very mechanical, it had a big curve. He preferred the tang knife, which was straight and sharp. Of course, the tang knife was a little long, so it was more convenient to use it for assassination. But, at this time, it was good enough that he had a knife to use. How could he be so calculative? Yang Yi pulled out the scimitar and looked at the blade. After confirming that there was no mistake, he put it back into the sheath and placed it on his waist. Then, he took off one of the communication headphones and put it on himself. There were also gloves. Yang Yi wanted to make sure that he did not leave any traces behind. Naturally, there were 2 automatic rifles. Yang Yi brought one along and stuffed 2 magazines into his trouser pocket. After walking out from the men's washroom, Yang Yi was in no hurry to do anything else. He dashed back into the women's washroom. On one hand, he wanted to put back the broken crystal high heels. If he had known it would not be useful, he would not have broken it. On the other hand, he wanted to inform Murphy and the children that he was safe. When the door to the women's washroom was opened, Murphy heard the movement. She immediately became nervous. Her face turned pale and she was at a loss as to what to do. Thankfully, Yang Yi's gentle voice made her feel safe. "It is me." Murphy's tense heart finally relaxed somewhat. Her body slumped down and tears silently flowed out from her eyes. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.